She wants the company to stay together. And that's been the whole Skydance pitch. Not so sure a private equity holder like Apollo would want to do the same thing. I'm sure they'd want to be as strategic as possible and sell the company for parts, if you will.
Geetha, do we know how credible the Sony Apollo deal is? How serious they are? Do they have financing? Have they given any strategic plan to the board? How serious is that bid, do you think?
I think it's pretty serious. I think Sony here is kind of really looking at this long term. They've already had huge success, Paul, just with the strategy that they've undertaken. Remember, Sony is the only major media player, the major Hollywood studio that hasn't really gone into streaming in a big way. And that bet actually has paid off for them, as opposed to Paramount, which has lost over $5 billion on its streaming business. Instead, you had Sony, ever since they've kind of rejiggered under Tony Vinciquerra, you had a business which was basically generating about $250 million in EBITDA. He's grown that business now to over $1.25 billion. So obviously their whole content arms dealer kind of strategy has worked. There is obviously a lot of synergy, Paul, when you combine the studios. I mean, Skydance and Paramount, that combination, they're talking about $3 billion in synergy. Sony is even larger, so I'm assuming they can extract a whole lot more. So I think they're serious.
Paul thinks you're tired of him. Is this true?
She's had enough of me.
Isn't everybody tired of him?
Isn't there? Oh,
yeah, exactly.
Everyone's tired of Paul. I'm not tired of Paul. Hey, Geetha, what do you think? Would there be regulatory issues with the Sony thing?
Oh.
Like what? Yeah.
So the regulatory issues, yes, because no foreign company can own a major broadcast network. That said, I mean, there have been, some cases in the past where companies have worked around this. A great example that comes to mind is Televisa, which is a Mexican broadcaster that came in and kind of, did this deal to own a 45% stake in Univision. So again, it's going to be interesting to see exactly how, they play out. I'm not sure exactly how they're going to structure it. There definitely is a lot of regulatory hurdles to overcome. That's with the Apollo Sony deal. With the Skydance deal, it's a lot of litigation that's potentially down the road. So again, both deals are fraught with troubles one way or the other. So what might happen at the end of this weekend is there is no deal at all, and Paramount might have to go it alone.
All right, very interesting. Geetha, we'll stay on top of that. I know you will. Geetha Raghunathan, she is the analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence, covering all of the media stuff. She is on top of it. So yeah, I guess we'll maybe get some news as soon as tonight, or maybe not at all. And you wake up Monday morning and they're going to have to kind of go it alone here, which is not a good spot for Paramount, I don't think. I think most investors would say, you're not big enough, you need to get bigger somehow.
Yeah, I think also just no one knows how to do it. Like, no one knows how to do news and entertainment and digital and the whole and streaming. Like, no one knows how to do that yet.
Profitably. Exactly right. Exactly right.
And so until you have a model that works, like, it's just, I feel like it's just throwing darts at a board.
Yeah, and I think probably the company that's, I think, is most ready to do it and is having a lot of success is Disney. But again, they have to improve the profitability of their streaming business and get that profitable. But we know, you take a look at Netflix, it can be done very, very profitably. S&P 500 up 1%. We'll have more coming up. This is Bloomberg.
news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Apple shares up 6.7% after last night's earnings report. Mandeep Singh is a senior tech analyst with Bloomberg Intelligence.
Look, I think they announced the biggest buyback in the history of S&P 500, and that just goes to show that when it comes to capital allocation, they are probably the most shareholder friendly. Even if, the company has got a lot of headwinds, there wasn't much to cheer about in terms of, a replacement cycle, driving top line growth.
Even so, shares up 6.7%. Bloomberg's Mandeep Singh, and it has been more than 18 months since Apple last updated its iPad line, marking the longest gap in new models since Steve Jobs first unveiled the product in 2010. That drought finally ends May 7th. That's the day that CEO Tim Cook is poised to introduce major upgrades to the iPad Pro and iPad Air, as well as new versions of the tablet's accessories. Coinbase Global posted higher than forecast first quarter profit, and as a resurgence in cryptocurrency prices reawakened demand from individual investors, but the stock is trading lower today. Coinbase down by 3.6%. Amgen soaring after its CEO said he was very encouraged by early results from a study of the company's experimental obesity drug Maritide. The Thousand Oaks, California-based company has emerged as a potential competitor to Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk, which so far dominate the weight loss market. We've got Amgen shares surging now by 13.2%. And those are our top company stories at this hour. I'm Charlie Pellet, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
Happy Friday, everybody. Happy Jobs Day. I'm Alex Steele alongside Paul Sweeney. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We are live from Interactive Broker Studio right here in Midtown Manhattan. Also, check us out on YouTube. Let's get you updated now with world and national news. Here is Michael Barr. Michael?
Thank you very much, Alex, Paul, Charlie. Donald Trump's criminal hush money trial is back in session today in New York. And former Trump aide Hope Hicks is testifying right now. Yesterday, the lawyer who negotiated Stormy Daniels' $130,000 hush money payment, Keith Davidson, says that he texted an editor at the National Enquirer the night Trump won the election with the phrase, quote, "What have we done?" Davidson says it was gallows humor. This morning, before walking into the courtroom, Trump spoke to reporters in the hall criticizing the judge.
He's trying to make it as salacious. He's allowing things in that have nothing to do with this case, nothing to do with it. And he's allowing things in, but nothing for us. He gives everything to the corrupt DA.
Today, the judge told Trump he has the right to testify if he wants to, after Trump said a gag order prevents him from testifying. One of the nation's busiest highways is completely shut down in a bustling area of Norwalk, Connecticut. A massive fire erupted when a gasoline tanker crashed and severely damaged an overpass on I-95. Governor Ned Lamont.
It involved the tractor-trailer truck, it involved the fuel truck, it involved the passenger automobile.
No one was seriously hurt. They started dismantling the fire-damaged overpass this morning. They hope to reopen it on Monday. A jury in Los Angeles has sentenced a scuba dive boat captain to 4 years in prison for criminal negligence. Jerry Boylan skippered a vessel that caught fire off the California coast in 2019, killing 34 people on board. This relative of one victim is not satisfied.
He never once said, "I was wrong." And that's the part that angers me tremendously. He never accepted responsibility for his role in this.
Boylan is appealing. The Department of Health and Human Services announced today that it would extend Obamacare to people under the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, which provides work permits and deportation prevention for people who came to the U.S. as undocumented children. HHS Secretary Javier Becerra says about 1/3 of DACA recipients don't have health insurance. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. Paul, Alex.
All right, thank you so much, Michael Barr. So here's one for you. It's the top story right now on the Bloomberg terminal. Apparently, elite New York City high schools are under fire with the segregation suit revised. So this revived, I should say. This is the suit. So a group that advocates for racial integration in New York schools claims that city and state policies disproportionately benefit white and Asian American students by creating a, quote, radicalized admissions pipeline to gifted and talented programs, as they're called. So basically, this is talking about schools like Bronx Science and Stuyvesant, where students compete for access to those programs. They have tons of tests and interviews, and apparently that can begin as early as kindergarten. And this is now in the spotlight for the public school system in New York.
What I did not know until reading this story is how that it begins at the earliest kindergarten level. The 2018-2019 Gifted Kindergarten Program, for example, included white and Asian American children at more than double their share in the overall kindergarten population, while for Hispanic and Black kids, it was only 1/3 and 1/4 of their overall shares. So it starts as early as kindergarten. That is tough.
So I think that the idea of the G&T programs, my best friend works for the DOE, is that you actually find the kids that are gifted and talented, and then you put them in a special program and help. And the idea is that that's going to help equalize it. The problem is those with access to information and money and tutors can tutor their kids to get the test scores to get them into a program, which is totally not the point. And the idea is if you get into these elite schools, you get into the elite colleges. My daughter's public school, though, integrates all the kids. So the kids that need special ed or the kids that are talented, so it helps to equalize it. But anyway, this is huge. This is a big deal for all education.
In New York City, this is
huge.
This is big. Okay, well, pay attention to this. So it's back into the courts, and we'll see how that plays out. Balance of Power with Joe Matthew. He's in the big town, New York City, in our studios. That starts right now.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Washington, D.C.
As bad news on Main Street becomes good news in Washington, welcome to the fastest show in politics, with U.S. jobs posting the smallest gain we've seen in 6 months, turns into a party on Wall Street, and good news, at least privately, at the White House. We're going to be talking a lot about the jobs report, the political implications over the course of the next hour, beginning with a special conversation. Bloomberg's Michael McKee talking with the former St. Louis Fed President Jim Bullard. Will be joined as well by Mark Hamrick, Bankrate's Washington bureau chief, with new research on the job market. Donald Trump listening to Hope Hicks on the stand today in his trial. Dave Ehrenberg, Palm Beach State's attorney, is going to be with us later this hour. And, of course, our great panel will be with us. Jeannie Shanzano for the Democrats, Lisa Camuso-Miller, Republican strategist, with us today. And it's all after a look at Wall Street. We are in New York, side by side with Charlie Pellet. How's it going?
It's going very well, Joe Matthew, and great having you here in New York. Indeed, the big story out of Washington, the jobs report, but certainly reverberations to the upside, big time on Wall Street. S&P up 57 now, 51.21. That is a gain of 1.1%. Wall Street taking a slowdown in the jobs market as an indication that the Fed will be able to start cutting rates as early as September. The Dow up 444 points now, up by 1.2%. NASDAQ, the composite index, up 302, up 1.9%. 10-year, 4.50%, with a 2-year, 4.79%. Spot gold down $10 the ounce to $22.93, drop there of 0.5%. West Texas Intermediate crude down 60 cents a barrel now, down by 0.7%. All about the jobs report, and yes, all about Apple earnings. Apple after earnings up by 6.8%, but non-farm payrolls advanced 175,000 last month, the smallest gain in 6 months. Unemployment rate ticked up to 3.9%. Wage gain slowed. Administration to the reaction to the jobs report from acting U.S. Labor Secretary Julie Su.
The unemployment rate is still under 4%. That's the 27-month straight that is the case. And the prime age labor force participation rate remains strong. It ticked up a little bit. And for women, it's the highest it has been since this number's been recorded, which was begun in 1948.
Indeed, something for everybody in today's report. The S&P again reacting to the upside with a gain of 1.2%. The S&P now at 5122. I'm Charlie Pellet. Balance of Power continues now. Once again, here's your host, Joe Matthew.
Charlie, thanks for preparing for a fascinating conversation here, and I'm sure one that you're going to be listening closely to with our own Michael McKee, talking with the former St. Louis Fed President Jim Bullard. That's going to start any moment now. We'll bring this conversation to you live. But Charlie, isn't it something, just the way that things can change? You've been covering the markets for a lot of years. The overnight change with a data point or an Apple earnings release, it's just remarkable how
Indeed.
this can
and
turn on a dime.
I think the sense when we left last night is that today was going to be a move, either a big upside move or a big downside move, all depending on what came out of Apple last night, all depending on that jobs report today. And certainly, too, the shift in interest rate cut expectations going from 6 or 7 at the start of the year to 1 or 2 now, depending on who you talk to.
Isn't that something?
Yep.
Charlie, coming off a Fed meeting this week, we bring you a special conversation you will not hear anywhere else right now. Michael McKee sitting down with former St. Louis Fed President Jim Bullard. This is live on Bloomberg.
That's big in this game, and that's the kind of thing we haven't seen on that variable in many, many years. So very successful. But as you know, the January, February, March reports stalled out a little bit. But you're still sitting at 2.8% on a 12-month basis. So I think the challenge for the committee is to somehow take that disinflation on board, because it does mean that you should have a lower policy rate without signaling that you're giving up on the last bit of inflation, 80 basis points that you need to get back to 2%. So I think that's the fundamental challenge. I think the wind's been blowing in the wrong direction during the first quarter and into April here.
Well, we have a lot of bond investors who watching these programs and listening to this show. Why do you think we need lower rates? The argument from the Fed, from Jay Powell, even on Wednesday, was that the economy is fine right now where it is, and we don't need to do anything.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good problem to have. The committee's been very, very successful here. The economy's growing at a good pace. Labor market is very strong. Today's report, a little softer than last time, but still a very solid report. And, inflation's above target, but not nearly as much as it was. And certainly most people think it's going to head back to target as we go forward. So these are good problems to have. So it's mostly about the tactics of exactly how to play this going forward. Now, one thing is that inflation, by the metrics I've been talking about, is only 80 basis points above target, but the policy rate is some 250 basis points above neutral. So that's a lot, given that you're only a relatively small distance from target. So that adjustment has to be made at some point. They have to get going on that at some point, but they want to do that, I think, when the wind's blowing in a little better direction for them.
Well, there's an argument that the things that are causing inflation these days are not things that are affected by monetary policy. So whether you're set too high or not, it isn't going to bring down inflation from here.
No, I don't really think so. I think inflation is a monetary phenomenon that's assigned to the central bank. The central bank can control inflation over a 5-year period, over the medium term. And this episode is showing how powerful that can be. So I think it really is up to the Fed to get the inflation rate in the medium term. There certainly is noise in the data, but that's not the main thing. I don't think the noise can be positive or negative on a given day, but the trends are controlled by the central bank.
Was there a risk if they leave policy too tight for too long?
There is. I think it's not a huge risk, but inflation could come down as we go through the rest of this year. I think many are thinking that that's going to happen, and the policy rate's way up in the 5% range, which would be too high for that kind of situation. So I think if the right moment arises, they can make a move and start to inch the policy rate down. Now, another thing I think is you can make a move without promising a whole sequence of moves. You just make a move because you want to take on board the good news that we've had since last summer.
Let me ask you, from your long experience on the committee, how you think about the markets and their relationship to the Fed. I did a chart yesterday and put it out on X if people want to look for it. It shows since July of 2023, the Fed funds rate hasn't moved. Fed hasn't acted at all, and yet the markets have gone like this. Does that affect how you think about the transmission of policy, or the criticisms that you're behind or ahead of the curve, or do those affect the way you think?
No, it's critically important, and I think economists, even today, are still struggling to understand exactly how this complicated dance works, because it's not just the policy rate today, but the expected policy rate in the near term. One way to look at that is the 2-year Treasury yield, and if you look at that over the last year or a year and a half, it's I've called that chart Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, because at different junctures it looked like the Fed would go higher, then it looked like the Fed might go lower, and while the policy rate itself is a fairly smooth chart, the 2-year has been going up and down because of expectations about Fed policy. So I do think that's critically important as to how policy works. I think it helped the Fed when we were raising rates. The 2-year went up much faster than the actual policy rate. That was helpful. And last December, when Chair Powell said that the rate cuts were coming into view, the markets ran with that, and the 2-year declined maybe 100 basis points, and now it has come all the way back. So it's a lot of volatility. I know the MOVE index is high, so it's very important, I think.
You talked about the expected future path of monetary policy. Now that you're not on the committee and don't have to worry about it, what is your expected path? Do you think they will cut this year?
I do. I do think they'll get a moment where it'll make sense, and you will get a little bit further disinflation. That'll allow them to come down out of the 5% range. But it's going to be data dependent, and it's a fickle world. So when you're looking at the data, you never quite know what's around the corner in macroeconomics. But I do think they'll find their moment here to get the policy rate down, but still stay restrictive. I think that's the key thing. Even if they came into the high 4s somewhere, that would still be a relatively high policy rate. It would still be putting downward pressure on inflation. So to me, the goal is to get from here to get inflation to asymptote down to 2%. So you want this gentle landing, ideally this gentle landing into 2%. So hopefully they can get that.
Colleges have been in the news a lot lately for all the wrong reasons. One last question. What was easier, being on the Fed board or being a dean at a college?
They're both very challenging jobs, and I like that. I like to, be actively involved in doing a lot of things all the time. But we've got a lot of growth at the Daniel School of Business, and a lot of support from our alums and many outside the university as well. So it's a great project. It's not easy, but it's a great project, and we're having a lot of fun.
Jim Bullard, former St. Louis Fed Bank president, now dean of the Daniel School of Business at Purdue University. Thank you for joining us today here.
Great conversation. Thank you, Michael McKee. And welcome to Balance of Power if you're just joining us on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube. I'm Joe Matthew at World Headquarters in New York. And great to hear the conversation, a news-making one, with the former president of the St. Louis Fed. Fascinating to hear just everyone evolve with the data. Certainly the markets are today, and to hear the former St. Louis Fed president say the soft landing for the U.S. economy is in view is something that we are obviously going to hear. That's the kind of news that the White House wants to listen to. And following this jobs data this morning, we may be in a different world. It certainly feels like it than we were 24 hours ago, certainly coming off of the Fed meeting and some of the more recent data that we've seen on GDP and jobs. Mark Hamrick joins us now, I'm glad to say, from our Washington Bureau, the Bankrate Washington Bureau Chief. He's senior economic analyst at Bankrate and has been researching this jobs data for us. Mark, it's great to have you on Bloomberg. Welcome. The stuff that we were hearing just now from Jim Bullard reinforces this view that the Fed may actually stick the soft landing. How are you looking at this report today?
Good to be with you, Joe, and thanks for having me. I think what he's saying is very parallel to what the Fed chairman said just a few days ago, and that is there are a number of possible paths ahead, and some of those paths may well be constructive, meaning we avoid a hard landing, we avoid a contraction in the economy in the next, let's say, 6 to 12 months, and that the hope is indeed aligned with the prayer that inflation will continue to come down. There are other paths, though, that could involve events that we can't even predict. And so what I think I would prefer to associate myself with in this discussion is the high degree of uncertainty, to acknowledge that there are multiple paths and that we don't have a high degree of certainty about a particular path.
Okay, so we're data dependent, as we have been. We're awfully used to that. But you can feel the shift in sentiment here. Can't you, Mark? Does that change your view?
Well, it's one day's worth of data, but obviously an important set of data.
Yeah.
You know, and you can concoct a variety of paths just from today. For example, the payrolls number coming in with a gain of 175,000 jobs, that's a decline of 40% from the previous month's revised number. So you can come up with a scenario where that trajectory goes lower, that we get a much more pronounced slowing in the economy. I don't think that's the base case, but I would say broadly, this is a very well-balanced report, which does take sort of the hot plate of porridge out of the choice of 3 too hot, too cold, just right today alone, and we'll see what the next rounds of data bring us.
What are the next rounds that matter to you? Are we back to obsessing over CPI, or is it the jobs report that's kind of leading your view?
I think we're mostly obsessing about the consumer price index over the jobs report, and that's painful for me to say because I've always loved following the employment data. But, you know, when you're talking about the Fed prioritizing the part of the mandate with stable prices, although it was interesting to hear Chairman Powell this past week say, well, perhaps we need to be paying just a bit more attention now to maximum employment than we were before. I still think the CPI is the star of the show because there was nothing in the statement that led us to believe that we're going to be prioritizing the employment side. It is that we need greater confidence about coming down to that heavily talked about 2% target.
You're looking at average hourly earnings in this report. We've been with an eye on inflation, watching that number carefully, up 3.9% over the past year. Pay is exceeding inflation, which is a really good thing for Joe Biden to say. But how concerning could that be if this trend continues when we consider the possibility of a wage spiral, of this starting to become a vicious cycle where the Fed needs to worry again?
Well, I think, first of all, Chairman Powell's been pretty consistent, and I think the data supports the view that the job market has not been the primary cause of inflation in the sense of wage growth leading that. We know the imbalance between supply and demand broadly in the supply chains really fed that. The war against Ukraine was another straw to sort of break that camel's back. And we had a decline in the sort of month-over-month annualized look at average hourly earnings. So we're not above 4% as we were before. We're at 3.9. So I think it's reasonable to expect that with this moderation or normalization we have in the job market, that we will not have a wage price spiral. We had a number of things seasonally occurring at the beginning of the year with 22 states, dozens of localities raising their minimum wages. That had to have been affecting the data. And we know there were a number of negotiated settlements involving unions that also probably lifted some of that. So I would look at some of that as being seasonal or temporary, and that would probably be consistent with numbers that are not as high going forward.
Got it. We're spending time with Mark Hamrick from Bankrate here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio and on YouTube. If you want to find us now, go to YouTube, search Bloomberg Global News. You'll see Mark Hamrick's palatial office while you're at it. Mark, what's the most stubborn problem here in the inflation conversation? I know you're watching oil. It's a little bit of a wild card, but shelter has been a real problem here moving forward. It just doesn't want to budge.
Well, it seems to be services excluding shelter because, as the chairman said this week, the rents data, as it's measured, doesn't seem to be matching what's happening in the marketplace. And so it is expected that as we get essentially the shelter part of all this sort of better reflected in the data, that the CPI in the shelter component as well as services more broadly may behave better. But we know, for example, there are all kinds of almost extraordinary things going on in the economy that may not relent. And I would point to things like the extraordinary increases in the cost of car insurance that are caused by a number of different factors, but climate change is part of that. Some of them are sort of post-pandemic impacts of people not seeming to be able to drive very well anymore, but also the sharp rise in car prices and the extraordinary costs associated with repairing a car. So I obviously still on the services side, but we do need to see more disinflation resume on the good side. And if we can get alignment, for the most part on both of those, we might be in a better shape. And I think that's sort of the consensus expectation right now.
Well, I'm glad we could get some time with you today, Mark. Don't be a stranger. Thanks for joining us on Bloomberg. That's Mark Hamrick from Bankrate on this Jobs Day. I'm Joe Matthew at World Headquarters in New York as we balance a couple of stories today, because in this city, Donald Trump is back in court, and so is Hope Hicks. This is a fascinating development here in the criminal trial, the former president, the hush money trial, of course, that's now underway. Hope Hicks, one of his closest associates over the years, a personal assistant who was always there to take care of Donald Trump, is now testifying against him, speaking as we speak about the day she learned of the Access Hollywood tapes. Quite remarkable, she said. After getting the email about the tape, she went to the 25th floor of Trump Tower to talk about it. Donald Trump was doing debate prep at that moment in a conference room with Jason Miller, Kellyanne Conway, Steve Bannon, Jared Kushner, and his no longer friend, Chris Christie. She verbally explained the email, she said, to Trump, and the group sought to, quote, absorb the shock of it, unquote. We're joined in studio here in New York right now in the throes of this conversation by Dave Ehrenberg. Yes, the Palm Beach County State Attorney is here and with us in studio. It's great to see you, sir. What a treat.
Great to be back with you, Joe.
Absolutely. I don't know what's got you in Manhattan, but we're watching this trial unfold here, and I believe you made clear already at one point that Hope Hicks could be the slam dunk testimony for the prosecution. What are we learning so far?
Well, at first, she started by saying she doesn't remember being in the room where they had that discussion between Pecker, Cohen, and anyone else in the room at the time. I think it was and Trump himself back in August 2015, where everything hit the fan. They were trying to plan a strategy to suppress these bad stories. Now, that's troubling that she doesn't remember that. How do you not remember being in that meeting? You would think you'd remember that. She does remember, though, being on a conference call, on calls with these players. So she's going to help the prosecution, but perhaps not as much as the state thought.
What do they want to hear from her today? When is the job done?
They want to hear corroboration that Trump was part of the scheme and that this scheme was in response to the Access Hollywood tape. Because after they came out, people thought the campaign was doomed and they couldn't afford another Stormy Daniels to come out where there was more trash about Trump. And so that's why they entered into the scheme to influence the election, because prosecutors have to prove that not just there was a falsification of business records, but it concealed a campaign finance crime, and that would be the felony.
Is Hope Hicks' testimony then more credible than Michael Cohen or Stormy Daniels because of her prior relationship with Donald Trump? That's been the conventional wisdom here.
Prior and current relationship.
Are they still close?
Well, they're not enemies. She has no axe to grind. I don't know how close they are, but she has no axe to grind. That's why she's powerful for the state. You see, the defense is going to try to discredit Michael Cohen, the key witness, by saying, you guys hate each other. Michael Cohen has prior felonies, all that stuff. They're going to try to discredit David Pecker by saying you're under a non-prosecution agreement. It's in your incentive to deal with the prosecutors and make up stuff. And they've already tried to discredit Keith Davidson, by saying, you're a sleazebag. You have sleazebag clients. You travel in this sleazy world of paparazzi. Of course, Trump traveled in that world too. But with Hope Hicks, what do they have? They have a loyalist who's trying to do the right thing, apparently, and tell the truth, although sometimes her memory seems to be faltering.
Got it. So what does cross-examination look like for her then?
they're going to try to poke holes in her testimony. They're probably going to treat her with kid gloves.
Yeah, okay.
And they're going to try to say, you don't remember this, you don't remember that, do you? Yes. And that's where they'll try to say, like, you know, you can't rely on her to corroborate Michael Cohen when she doesn't remember a lot of these specifics.
How about that? There's a gag order ruling that we're waiting for, a second gag order ruling as well. 4 more violations alleged. The hearing yesterday, does that mean another $4,000 check, which Donald Trump would probably write at dinner anyway?
Yeah, it's pocket change for him. You know, as long as they're going to fine him, and they're pretty limited to how much they can fine him. They've got the statute for $1,000 per violation, and Judge Merchan is stuck. If he really wants to ratchet it up, he could put him in timeout. They have like a little holding cell inside that courtroom, inside the courthouse. Yeah, I don't think it'll go to that. I mean, but maybe. There's no way he's going to be incarcerated pre-trial, but could he be put in a room to sit there for a few hours?
Could he really do that, though? He's got the authority to do it. The Secret Service would have to have some kind of a sidebar, right? How would that work?
They could just put him in a room by himself.
Just give him an office and shut the door.
Yeah, right.
Time out.
That'll teach you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you know, he should be treated like everyone else in my mind. I mean, if you violate a court's gag order, you should be sanctioned. Defendants in my courthouse, if they criticize the judge or witnesses,
so let's talk
jurors,
about that.
yeah, you're done.
What done? You go to jail, or I mean, what if Joe Matthew was standing in there and I said that, you know, this guy's a sleazebag and did all of that stuff? Is there a first warning? I get it. Do I start with a fine, or would you actually lock me up?
No, they would start with a fine and then a strong warning. And if you continue to do it, you would be wearing orange.
If I had 10 to 15 violations, that would be in jail.
Yeah, they'd fit you with some steel bracelets.
Okay, great. I mean, you know, we do need to ask these questions, particularly as he talks about the weaponization of the justice system when he is in fact being treated better than anyone else would be.
His supporters say that there's a 2-tiered system of justice. I would agree, but not in the way they're thinking. I think he's being treated better. Any other defendant who did this, who continually and intentionally violated the court's gag order and went after the judge and his daughter, oh yeah, I mean, they'd be picking up trash on the side of the highway.
There seems to be a feeling, based on smarter minds than mine who come on this program, that this trial is not going to need 6 to 8 weeks, that we're moving along here. What do you think of the timeline at this point?
Judge Merchan is a no-nonsense judge. He's moving things along.
Yeah.
It is pretty telling when Trump was complaining that he can't be on the campaign trail because of this. This is not right. But on the same time, he's also complaining how quickly the trial is going. So, you know, whatever it is, it's grievance on both sides. Too fast, too slow, it's too cold in the courtroom, whatever it is, he's being treated unfairly. Bottom line is judges matter, and Judge Merchan wants this thing to get finished sooner than later, and it will.
You know, he made clear yesterday on Truth Social that he's not been sleeping. Did you see that in the courtroom?
He said
doesn't like he's closing his beautiful blue eyes.
Yes, it's
and
very
taking it all in.
Very poetic. You know, he's got to keep up with images, right? He's the alpha male, and alpha males don't fall asleep during testimony, especially when he's calling the current president Sleepy Joe. You can't use that moniker if you're falling asleep while you're at your own trial.
I think I heard Sleepy Don at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, right? That's already out there now.
Yes, I didn't know he had blue eyes, by the way.
No, you didn't?
No, I didn't pay that close attention.
Well, I think he said they're beautiful.
He did say they're beautiful.
Blue eyes, yeah. So maybe he'll be out of this thing sooner than he thinks. At what point when this trial, when the testimony resumes, how long will we wait for this to go to the jury? What's that process going to be like?
After the testimony is over, you'll have closing arguments, and then it goes to the jury right after the judge reads the jury instructions. And then we'll see if we can get a unanimous 12-member jury to agree on a verdict. It could be a hung jury. And I do think, though, it's very unlikely to be an acquittal. The evidence that I've seen, the witnesses I've seen have been pretty powerful. So if I had to guess, I would say this is headed towards a conviction. Now, I don't think he's going to serve any prison time for this. I think he gets probation or maybe house arrest at most, but he'll appeal whatever the final verdict will be anyways.
If he's found guilty, though, and he's brought into the courthouse for all of that stuff, he is going to end up in a room at some point that day, right? I mean, what happens if he's found guilty and he's not given jail time? Does he just walk out of there and get in the SUV, or there's still going to be a long day for him to do whatever is done with the paperwork and the rest of it?
Yeah, he'll get processed, but he'll leave. He'll go home. He's not going to be remanded back to back into a jail cell.
Sure.
And then he'll come back for sentencing, which could take place a month later. And then the sentencing, I think, will not force him into jail. And even if they did say your sentence includes incarceration, he will appeal, and then the appeals will last well beyond the election.
Got it. You going to the courthouse now?
I'm flying home.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, man, going back to Palm Beach.
There's a big party in Palm Beach this weekend. You heard about that, right? Did you get invited?
At Mar-a-Lago?
The big Veep Stakes party.
Yeah, but somehow my invitation, I think, was lost in the mail.
Okay. I think is it in Hollywood, Florida? No, it's in Palm Beach. I didn't get mine either.
Yeah, also, I'm not eligible to be VP because if you come from the same state, it means your electoral votes in Florida will be tossed.
Marco Rubio is going to move to another state, is what I heard.
Yeah. If Marco Rubio is the VP nominee, I will eat my ID badge that they gave me today at Bloomberg.
If you're with us on YouTube, you see he's got the coolest pin in the room. Someday I want one of those with the badge. Dave Ehrenberg, Palm Beach County State Attorney. A great help to us getting through this legal saga, and it's great to see you in person, Dave, here in New York. Get home safe.
Thank you.
I'm Joe Matthew at World Headquarters. This is Balance of Power as we add the voice of Tim O'Brien. What a perfect day to have the senior executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion, who, of course, wrote the book on Donald Trump. And, Tim, it's great to see you. Welcome back. What is it like for Donald Trump to see loyalists like Hope Hicks sit on the stand today?
Well, I think he has to weigh whether people who have traditionally been loyalists, Joe, are willing to sacrifice themselves to someone who's always viewed loyalty as a one-way street. And there are a lot of people around him who are loyal to him, but they haven't been tested in a courtroom. And I think one of the complications for Hope Hicks is she doesn't want to perjure herself in this trial. She really has nothing at stake because she was a message bearer for Donald Trump. But if she lied about things she knew about his relationship with either of the women, and there's material evidence that maybe what she said publicly was at odds with what was in email or other people witnessed, I think that she'll probably not want to toy with that reality and run into deeper trouble simply in the interest of being loyal to Donald Trump. So I assume she's speaking her mind up there. I've been following it. I was in the courtroom yesterday. I wasn't there today, and I'm following her testimony right now at a distance. And she seems to be proceeding apace, and I have to believe that absolutely rankles Donald Trump.
Did you say you were there yesterday, Tim?
Yeah, I've been at the courthouse several times now. Yeah, and I was there yesterday.
Well, take me into the courtroom, especially with your view. What are you seeing that's compelling you?
The first thing to recognize, Joe, is this is the criminal court of the New York State Supreme Court, and both the civil and criminal branches of the court are very bonfire of the vanities venues, populated by judges with lots of different personalities. And lots of cases have historically moved through those courtrooms that involve powerful names in New York and scandalous comings and goings. And this is probably one of the most epic cases in that context to ever roll through there. And there's a huge media gaggle every day. There are no Trump supporters at all. He's been saying people are outside protesting when I can't speak. And virtually, like, the only guy out there is a troubled man with a large bell and a cross and some verbiage about Trump on his T-shirt, walking around the park every morning, ringing his bell, starting at about 7 a.m., which is typically when I get there.
Fascinating.
Yeah, reporters are shepherded in. There's a main courtroom where some of our Bloomberg reporters are, and then there's a joint overflow room, and I've been in the overflow room.
So you haven't made eye contact with him yet?
No, I have not made eye contact with Donald Trump. I'm trying to, I don't know the last time he and I ran into each other was at a White House Correspondents' Dinner, the famous one where Obama.
That was a fateful night for our nation.
If we were to believe that that's when Donald Trump decided to make a comeback, but that's I think other things were at work. Yeah.
If he gets elected, is the White House Correspondents' Dinner back on ice?
I imagine it is. He has always hated black tie events. He famously.
I thought he hated reporters.
He loves reporters. He hates bad coverage. He's a media addict. But he authentically hates charitable events and black tie events. And, Manhattan real estate, its lifeblood are these fundraisers that the elite of the real estate community
go to. And I used to talk to him. I asked him a number of times, why don't you go to these? And he's like, I hate those things. You wouldn't find me dead in a black tie. And then in very blue language, he described me what he'd rather be doing on a Saturday night that I can't share on your radio show.
Okay.
But I think he'd want nothing to do with the White House Correspondents' Center generally.
Is this wearing on him, or is he emboldened by being in court 4 days a week?
I think the answer is yes to both of those questions, but for different reasons. It is absolutely wearing it. Donald Trump has aged so significantly, even since, I think, 2022, but certainly since 2020 and definitely since 2016. He's a little more hunched over. His hair is getting harder to paste in an effective peekaboo way on the top of his head. His eyes are pouchy and red. He is tired. As we know, he's nodding off, or at least going into some fugue state of meditation during the court proceedings. And he hates being there. He's not in control of the script. This is the worst reality TV show a reality TV star could ever participate in, and he can't control the proceedings. So yeah, and he doesn't want to go to jail for whatever bravado he puts out there. People close to him have said he does not want to go to jail. The testimony in this case, he had a porn star into the front office of the Trump Organization, which is on the 26th floor of Trump Tower, and his residence where his wife was nursing their 4-month-old child, Barron, is about 30 floors above that. I don't know that he wants any of that out in the public, and it's there now.
Wow.
So no, he doesn't like this. On the other hand, I think he also is happy to use it as a venue to make his case that he's a victim and he's being unfairly prosecuted.
I'm really glad you could join us today. I didn't realize it was your day off of court, Tim. Thank you for being there for us as you bring your thoughts to Bloomberg Opinion. Find him on the terminal, OPIN Go, or at Bloomberg.com. Tim O'Brien, Bloomberg Opinion. Senior executive editor who, as I mentioned, wrote the book on Donald Trump, and it's great to get his view here. On social media, the former president, quote, "Contrary to the fake news media, I don't fall asleep during the crooked DA's witch hunt. Especially not today. I simply close my beautiful blue eyes sometimes, listen intensely, and take it all in. Kind of like here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm Joe Matthew in New York. We'll assemble the panel next. Stay with us on the fastest show in politics on Bloomberg.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Jobs Friday. Stocks continue to push higher. S&P right now up 63, 51.27, a gain of 1.3%. Wall Street took that slowdown in the jobs market as an indication that the Fed will be able to start cutting rates as early as September. Right now we have got the Dow up 456, up 1.2%. NASDAQ up 317, up by 2% right now. 10-year at 4.50% with a 2-year that's yielding 4.80%. Gold down $6 the ounce to $22.98, drop there of 0.3%, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil is lower by 0.7%, $78.40 for a barrel of WTI. Bitcoin at 62,000, surging 5.5% today. Again, the S&P up 62, up 1.2%. There is evidence that the U.S. economy hit a rough patch in April. And with that story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
Job growth slowed, unemployment increased, and data on service industry slumped. Employers scaled back, adding the fewest workers in 6 months, 175,000, and the unemployment rate edged up to 3.9%. The Labor Department data follow a slew of job cut announcements at major corporations from Tesla to Whirlpool. Separately, the ISM Services Industry Index dropped in April to the lowest since late 2022. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
Apple shares now up 6.6% after posting stronger than expected sales last quarter and predicted a return to growth in the current period, sparking optimism that a slowdown is easing. Again, Apple up now by 6.6%. Recapping stocks higher, S&P up 1.2%. Balance of power continues now. And once again, here's your host, Joe Matthew.
Charlie Pellet, thank you. Treat to be with Charlie here in New York as we bring you Balance of Power live from World Headquarters in Manhattan. Where else are you going to run into Dave Ehrenberg on a day Donald Trump is in court? So thank you for being with us on the radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube. A quick heads up, hour 2, important on this jobs day, as Charlie Pellet was just talking about the data this morning, the impact on Wall Street. It's impacting in Washington as well, and we're going to be joined by Heather Boucher of the White House Council of Economic Advisors coming up at the top of the next hour, 1 p.m. Washington time. So you do want to be with us to get the view from the administration. Of course, they don't want to comment on Fed policy. We realize that, but we've been hearing a lot of talk about a soft landing since 8:30 this morning, and we'll be curious to have Heather's view once Kaylee Lyons joins us, and we welcome our global TV audience to the conversation. It's time to assemble our panel as we turn our attention back to the campus protests that have engulfed not only campuses, but the nation here in a very divisive debate about our policy as a country when it comes to Israel and Gaza. Pressure on the president so intense that it brought him before cameras and microphones yesterday at the White House to denounce violence and anti-Semitism, but also to support the free speech rights of those protesters. He's going to be speaking in a more formal way in a speech next week, as we've told you. But we want to bring in our panel today for more on this. Jeannie Sheehan Zaino is with us, of course, Bloomberg Politics contributor and Democratic analyst, along with Republican strategist Lisa Camuso Miller, former communications director at the RNC and host of the Friday Reporter podcast. It's great to see you both with us. Jeannie, the numbers tell the whole story here. Arrests of Israel-Hamas war protesters have now exceeded 2,300 as police clear more encampments on campuses around the country. Is this getting worse as we go?
It is. And, you know, I think when the White House, like we all did, woke up yesterday morning to those scenes out of Los Angeles and out of the California system universities, they knew, rightly so, that the president had to come out and address this. Obviously, it was a very short statement. I think, to your point, the much more important statement is going to come at the Holocaust Memorial on Tuesday. And I think the president has an enormous task on his hands there. Because, of course, the best thing Joe Biden could say at this point is that the team, the administration, has been able to help negotiate a ceasefire. They obviously can't say that. So now he is forced to walk this very difficult line for any president, particularly a Democratic president. And that's what he tried to do the other day. I think the most important thing he said yesterday was in response to the reporter's question when asked if this had changed policy towards Israel, and he had the one-word answer of no, because this is all about policy. And he has said it hasn't changed policy. And so that, I think, was the most important thing we heard from him yesterday.
Well, that was the news, certainly, but the optics here are very difficult with police in riot gear, wearing helmets, wielding batons. Lisa, it's generating a lot of comparisons to 1968, and it's something that Senator Bernie Sanders talked about. I want you to listen to what he said, and I'll ask you about this comparison. Here he is.
I am thinking back, and other people are making this reference, that this may be Biden's Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson, in many respects, was a very, very good president domestically, brought forth some major pieces of legislation. He chose not to run in '68 because of opposition to his views on Vietnam.
Lisa, that was from an interview on CNN. The fact of the matter is, though, this is not Vietnam. Tens of thousands of Americans have not died in a war that is still going. If you want to complete the analogy here, is that a fair perspective?
Well, I think what the senator was trying to get to was that this could very well be the divisive moment in 24 that's going to define the election results. And I think, Joe, what we're seeing here not only is a generational shift in how people feel about what's going on in the Middle East, but also, too, it's one that could very well, if not handled right, could set us way back in our support for Israel and for our Jewish friends and everywhere else on the globe. And that, to me, it's a very delicate balance. And right now, I think, based on the conversations I'm having with my friends, people are very unhappy with the way the president is handling. It's not perceived to be a strong stance that he and the White House have here. And so there's got to be a real shift in the approach to this in order to quell some of the dissatisfaction, because those college kids on those campuses, while they're young and not necessarily a likely vote in November, their parents and their grandparents are also watching. And that, too, is, I think, something that we all have to really pay very close attention to. So I don't think that Senator Sanders is wrong. I think this could be a divisive moment in 24 and could very well be one that defines how President Biden is perceived in the ballot.
Jeannie, if that's true, Joe Biden, either in that analogy, doesn't even run again, or if he does, he loses. Do you think that these comparisons to 1968 apply to him?
You know, I think there is, there are things that are similar about it. Sure, I think the senator is reflecting what we've all been talking about. And obviously, it's not just in this one issue. There's a lot of similarities to 1968 and 2024 politically. When there is chaos at home, the incumbent, whoever that is, pays the price at the ballot box. That doesn't always mean losing, but it means paying the price. And certainly Johnson did that by withdrawing in '68. Donald Trump also experienced this with the chaos in terms of the Black Lives Matter movements, George Floyd and other in 2020. Chaos does not work to the benefit of the incumbent president. And Joe Biden's best hope here is obviously a ceasefire, that we're in May right now, that by the time we get to October, November, the ceasefire has been achieved and we have moved on. If that doesn't happen, this will be one of those rare elections in American politics where foreign policy issues play big. And that's a problem for any incumbent president. So I do think, Sanders is right to raise this. And the president is going to try as hard as he can to walk this line. And, from a campaign perspective, continue to make the case that you think I'm chaotic. Look at the other side. Look at Donald Trump. Because, again, anything in this election that focuses on Joe Biden is a loser for him. Anything that focuses on Donald Trump is a loser for him. So they're both going to be pointing fingers and trying to get the chaos marker moved from them to the other side. I mean, that's the hope here.
Republicans have tried to seize the moment on this. Lisa, we saw the Speaker of the House and prominent members of his conference stand on Columbia University's campus. How does Donald Trump seize on this?
Well, it's hard to say, Joe. He, at one point, was seen to be very strong and very supportive of the Jewish vote, in that he and his son-in-law, who was very active in securing that peace in the Middle East and in Israel, while he was in the White House. Now, whether or not all those things are true, it is the perception, right? And it's the way that the president and his former aides are referring to his leadership in that space. Unfortunately, I think that Republicans can very well, if they're not careful, they can find themselves in a place where they go too far. This is a tremendously tumultuous situation. It requires a tremendous amount of finesse and smarts. It took the Republicans a long time to get support to go overseas. And some people are still very unhappy with the way that all unfolded. So it is, to me, it can be, while it could potentially work in their favor, it could also be one that, if not handled correctly, it could also work against the president, the former president, as he runs for re-election.
Great conversation, a great panel. They're going to be back with us in our second hour. Lisa Camuso-Miller and Jeannie Shanzano here on Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew at World Headquarters in New York as we balance a couple of competing stories here today, but that's not unusual for us. With Donald Trump in court and Hope Hicks on the stand today, we have to get time with June Grasso, not to mention the fact that I'm here sitting right next to her, which never happens.
Yes,
the host
I know.
of Bloomberg
It's so
Law.
exciting.
What a treat. Nice to
It
see
is.
you.
It really is.
My gosh, this is kind of a big deal today. You and I have talked quite a bit about the importance of Hope Hicks' testimony, and all of a sudden she's talking. What do you make of the timing, for starters?
Well, it's the Friday afternoon witness effect. The prosecutors love to end on a Friday with a big witness, and hopefully, I'm sure they're thinking that she won't get to cross-examination. So what the jurors have in their mind all weekend is just her testimony.
Yeah.
And, you know, and as we've said, she's different from the other witnesses who have testified before because she doesn't have the credibility, or shall we say morality problems that some of them had. You know, the tabloid publisher or the sleazy lawyer who's out there
She made air quotes if you're just listening.
hawking these kinds of stories. I mean, uncross, that was how they tried to paint Keith Davidson. So she's different, and she has an eye on sort of all these things, all the scandals that Trump went through.
She was in the room.
She was in the room, or she was coming into the room or leaving the room. You know, so
right.
I think she has a lot of credibility, and obviously she does not want to be there.
Right. Well, so she's having trouble remembering some of these rooms, though, which is interesting. Dave Ehrenberg mentioned this a little bit earlier, and I know he was on Bloomberg Law as well. What a great legal mind to compare notes with here. Is she holding back, do we think, a little, just being very careful? How do you think she's performing so far?
You know, I think she has testified, in a couple of investigations already. So she's on the record in those investigations. So I think that she is probably being as truthful as she can be and remembering whatever she can. I mean, this is, if I would be an awful witness, I think about this all the time. If people ask me what I did 2 days ago, I'd be like, I have to look that up. Right. I have to check with so-and-so and so-and-so. So, I mean, it's hard to remember all these different things. But, I think you have to give her a credit, and also the fact that she is on the record in so many other interviews she's had, that she's probably, trying her best. And she's been prepped by the prosecution. So if she doesn't remember, she doesn't remember. Go on to the next incident. There are so many. Go on to the next one.
That's going to happen in any testimony,
I
assume. The gag order is something we're waiting to hear on again. I know there was a hearing yesterday. June, do we expect, kind of like last time, we get a Tuesday, Wednesday word on that next week?
I guess so, but I don't know what it matters, really.
Just write another $4,000 check.
It's just write another check. It's not like you're dealing with somebody who can't afford this. And so
what do you think of this idea that he sits him in a room to be alone for a while to think about himself? Not
like
jail.
A timeout?
It's not jail, but you have a timeout.
Okay, I mean, he could do a timeout, I guess, if he gets, annoyed enough, or put him in, overnight. But think about what that would mean if you put the former president in any kind of a cell, a holding cell or whatever. The Secret Service, I mean, how would it work?
So you have a sidebar with the Secret Service.
He wouldn't be alone. It wouldn't be a timeout because he'd be with all the Secret Service agents. So I just don't know. I mean, I sort of feel for Judge Mershon because he's trying. And you saw that this morning, because Trump yesterday said, I'm the gag order, it's stopping me from testifying. I'm not sure if he misspoke or he really meant to say that, preparing people that he may not testify after he said he would. Sure. And the judge this morning said, Mr. Trump, I want you to know you have the absolute right to testify, and there's no,
His lawyer does not want him to testify, right? I mean, if you,
you
in
know,
no world is the lawyer.
I know. I've talked to a lot of people because it sort of fascinates me because you would think, no, we've seen him on the stand. We've seen him in depositions.
Right.
And he's not a good witness in so many ways.
He does
but
what he wants.
the lawyers I've talked to said, you have to really wait to see what's happening. If things are going so badly for the defense by then, they may put him on the stand. It's a Hail Mary pass.
Wow, wouldn't that be a moment? I want to hear
we have to get
Bloomberg law
we
that
have to
night.
get into the courtroom if that happens.
Oh my God, absolutely. Now, have you corrected your reporting that he has not been falling asleep? He's closing, he's resting his beautiful blue eyes.
Oh, his beautiful blue eyes.
I'm just waiting for the corrections to come out here
I have
from
seen
somebody.
so many reports that he is sleeping in the courtroom, and
yeah.
there were some things about how he doesn't have all his diet, his Cokes all day long to keep him awake. I mean, there have been a lot of things said about this.
Hey, it's happening to the best of us.
But
I don't know.
In his defense, some of this, if you're sitting in a courtroom for hours and hours, I mean, I've been there, all the trials I've covered, it can get very,
Of course,
sleepy.
yeah.
Of course, if you're the defendant, you would think you'd be a little more alert, but, it's not an easy thing to be sitting there
No, my
all
God.
day
Tim
long.
O'Brien was on earlier describing him. He says he's aged a lot, he's hunched over. His hair, he's having trouble getting the hair right. He looks tired. His
want to
eyes
go there with
are.
the hair.
And
Don't
I thought he
take
was
me to the hair.
describing me. He said these big bags under his eyes. Like, yeah, man, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's happening to the best of us. Anyway,
Right, yeah.
if you put me in a courtroom, forget it.
It's
I'll
a tough
just stay in the
situation
studio
for
for now.
me. And there's one thing that happened. If you're used to being the president, you're used to being, commanding the room. When his longtime aide, Rona Graff, left the stand, apparently he went up to try to shake her hand.
Don't miss her on Bloomberg Law. It's June Grasso.
politics to the world of business. This is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
Wall Street loves the jobs report. How about the White House? Welcome to the fastest show in politics as today's softer employment data brings relief to the markets and Washington. I'm Joe Matthew at World Headquarters in New York, joined by Kaylee Lyons today in Washington. And Kaylee, with an eye on interest rates, a cooling jobs market appears to be good news for everybody.
Yeah, you got a downside surprise on payrolls and wage growth, the important inflationary aspect to this. And then, of course, the upside surprise on the unemployment rate at 3.9%, still below a 4 handle for the 27th month in a row. That is the longest stretch we have seen, and we will get reaction from the White House with Heather Boushey, a member of the Council of Economic Advisors, coming up. First, though, we got to get more on the market reaction to this jobs report. Charlie Pellet has a look at that up in New York.
Thank you very much, and here's what's going on. Well, certainly the big story out of Washington today, Jobs Friday, the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ 100 index. We'll throw in the Russell 2000 as well, all solidly higher right now. The Dow up 418, up 1.1%. S&P up 57, up 1.1%. We've got NASDAQ up 295, up by 1.9%. Bottom line here, equities wiping out the week's losses. Wall Street taking that slowdown in the jobs market as an indication that the Federal Reserve will be able to start cutting rates as early as September. 10-year right now, 4.51%. We've got the 2-year, 4.81%. Gold down $5 the ounce, down 0.2%. And West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.5%. The other big market story, Apple earnings. Apple shares up now by 6.8%. Balance of Power continues now. Back we go to Kaylee Lyons and Joe Matthew.
Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We'll be back with Charlie for another update on the market later on this hour with a perfect setup there for our conversation with Heather Boushey at the White House following the release of this jobs report. The headline says it all. U.S. jobs post smallest gain in 6 months as unemployment rises. We got reaction earlier today on Bloomberg TV and radio from the acting Labor Secretary, Julie Su. Here she is.
Wage gains continue to outpace inflation. That means that there's more money in workers' pockets. This is obviously, as you say, this is a sign of how good people feel. And a good job changes lives, and a good job with wages that are enough to sustain a family are really important. And we continue to combat inflation and high prices.
Reaction from the Labor Department today. Now let's get reaction from the White House. Joining us now from the North Lawn on Bloomberg TV and radio is Heather Boushey, a member of the Council of Economic Advisors. Heather, thank you so much for being here on Bloomberg. Obviously, while we did see some softening, perhaps it is not all too unexpected. The fact of the matter remains, though, that employment is something of a lagging indicator. If we're starting to see the softness show up in a more material way now, where do you expect that we will be by November?
Well, today's report is really good news. The acting secretary talked about it. We have seen this unemployment rate below 4% for a whopping 27 months. That's the longest stretch going back over half a century. And we don't see a lot of signs of softening. When you sort of dig under the hood, you look at the report, for example, we've seen that for women who are between the ages of 25 and 54, sort of the working age population, their labor force participation and their employment rates have hit series high, going back to 1948 when Rosie the Riveter went home. And of course, we also saw the black unemployment rate fall last month. So when you dig in, you actually see signs of people coming back into the labor force. You see, a strong labor market overall at that steady pace that we need to see at this point in the economic recovery.
So slow and steady have been the magic words from you from the get-go, Heather, as we've been talking about this since the very start of this administration. As we consider the idea of a soft landing, is this actually more the definition of stable growth?
This is what you want to see at this point in recovery. Our analysis at the Council of Economic Advisors is that you need about 100,000 jobs per month just to keep pace with population growth. And at 175,000, and 240 some odd thousand over the past 3 months, we are certainly above that basic pace. And, we continue to see healthy gains in wages. They've been abating in recent months, but certainly you see those steady gains, and particularly those stronger gains for the bottom 80% of the labor market that are production and non-supervisory employees. These are the kinds of gains that we want to see month after month, people being able to go out there and get a job, that low unemployment rate, those jobs that are being available, but yet not so hot that it's overheating the economy.
Well, Heather, speaking of what we've seen month over month, as you alluded to, the statistic, 27 months in a row with an unemployment rate below 4%. When you're modeling out what's going to happen to unemployment as we move forward, when are we going to be breaking above that 4% level?
Well, I'd like to see us break the next record in that streak, so it's not just going back for more than 50 years, but going back more than that. Certainly, the president's goal from day one was to get people back to work, keep that unemployment rate low. That is what helps boost wages across the country, makes it easy for folks who are out there who want a job to get into the labor market, to find that work, to switch jobs. And so we certainly want to see that unemployment rate kept in that low space. It's one of the goals of what we mean by a strong, stable jobs recovery. And I just want to emphasize that one of the things that we've seen that I think has been really impressive in this recovery, of course, has been that we've hit these historic lows for Black unemployment rate, for in the gap in the unemployment rate across states. We aren't at those lows right this month, but we have seen those, over the past year. And being able to see this kind of recovery that's giving so much opportunity to people all across the country in a way that is equitable and is, reaching into pockets of the economy. This is exactly what the president wants to see. It's good for the American people.
Well, Heather, I fully understand that the president would like to see unemployment remaining below 4%. It's just a question of whether or not that's going to continue to be realistic if we're talking about policy that is still tight and the lagged effects of the tightening that we have seen starting to kick in more substantially. I just wonder if realistically you think unemployment can stay this low if rates still remain this high for much longer.
Well, I cannot comment on Fed policy, which I think is implicit in this question. I think, what we are looking to see is, the president has made all of these investments all across the United States, investments in infrastructure, investments in new technology and manufacturing and good jobs, and we are still seeing those play out. We have had these very high numbers for investment in the construction of new manufacturing facilities. We are seeing, shovels in the ground for all these infrastructure projects, and so I remain optimistic that as we see this recovery progress, we'll be able to keep this kind of steady job gains. We've been able to deliver this for years now, and this is the economy. It's been the little engine that could, but we have a lot of investment that still is yet to come, and hopefully that will give some strength to the labor market, and we're starting from a very solid foundation here.
We're spending time with Heather Boucher, who's talking with us live from the White House on Bloomberg TV and radio. Heather, we started the program with a special conversation with the former St. Louis Fed President Jim Bullard. By the way, this is not a question about Fed policy, don't worry, but he did say that a soft landing for the U.S. economy is in view. Do you agree at this point? Is it already happening? Is this the type of report that confirms that?
Well, as we have seen month after month, and I've talked to you and, folks around the country about this is that kind of stable growth. A soft landing implies, that we already know exactly what's happened, that it's in the rearview mirror, but we're living this in real time. So I think that, as we watch the data, as we always do, this is the kind of the recovery we want to see. And, of course, on top of it, we have seen that, prices have come down 60% from their peak. We've actually seen over the past year the prices for some goods facing consumers like milk and eggs and used cars and airline fares, those are lower than they were a year ago. So we have seen some relief for families over time. And I think combined, this is the kind of, trying to find that sweet spot where you keep growing and you keep adding jobs and you keep making sure that workers receive their fair pay.
Heather, we were speaking earlier this week with someone from the Groundwork Collaborative. It used to work alongside Elizabeth Warren when we were talking about the way that Fed policy, which I won't ask you to comment on directly what the Fed should do with this policy, but the way that it is transmitting in the economy. Now that we have seen something of a stagnation in progress in getting inflation down, it bears questioning whether or not actually just pure interest rate policy is going to be able to get us that last mile down to 2%, or is it going to take something else, like more action from this administration?
Well, this president has remained committed to lowering Pain points for families in terms of prices across the economy. He's taken a series of steps, for example, on junk fees, making it possible for, consumers to not face those fees that just add up, those hidden fees. I often think of, what the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has done with credit card fees for consumers. But that's just one example of the variety of the ways that the president is focused on lowering prices. Think about what he's done to lower prescription drug prices, lower the price of insulin, lower the price of health care for families. All of this adds up and gives relief to families' pocketbooks. The president has been focused on creating these jobs and addressing real problems facing families all across the country.
Heather, it's hard to underscore the impact that immigration is having on our job market right now. It's borne out in the numbers, and I wonder to what extent the White House will make the case in the coming months, in the coming days, that immigration is an important driver of our job market and is, in fact, having an impact potentially for the better on inflation. How would you answer that?
Well, the president came into office. He had an immigration plan that he released on day one. He has worked to find sensible solutions here. Certainly what we want to see in the labor market is you want to see those folks who are on the sidelines, who want to get into the labor force, get access to those jobs. It's why I pointed to the fact that you have this historic high in labor force participation among women between the ages of 25 to 54, and you've seen good numbers on labor force participation more generally. That's people coming into the labor market, seeing those economic opportunities.
Heather Boucher of the White House Council of Economic Advisors with us live from the North Lawn at the White House. Heather, it's great to see you. Thanks for coming back to talk to us today on Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew in New York. Kaylee Lines is in Washington. And Kaylee, it's just a remarkable reminder on what a difference a single day's data can make on sentiment, if not interest rates themselves.
Yeah, I mean, think about the round trip we have made in terms of expectations for Fed cuts, which Heather Boucher would not talk to us about. We started the year thinking the Fed might cut up to 6 times. Yeah. Then we were down to 1 cut. It seems that we're pricing more of them back in on what many are saying is a Goldilocks jobs report. And we know, Joe, that President Biden is standing by his prediction last we heard. That's right. That there will be rate cuts this year.
Well, he may seem prescient at this point, and we all know this has a direct impact to what is happening on the campaign trail and where we're going to be, say, post-Labor Day, when people really start paying attention, Kaylee, young people who are actually watching interest rates with hopes to buy their first home, people who are, of course, looking at the gas pump every time they need to fill up their car. All of that's going to really start combining and colliding into people making opinions that are going to last until November. So they are hoping, no matter what they can say or not say about the Fed, they're hoping that cuts are coming.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to make a difference, the timing of those cuts. And of course, we heard from Chairman Powell in the press conference earlier this week saying they don't think about the political context at all. So all the market expectation that it would be hard to cut in September just ahead of the election or in November just after it, maybe that is not so much the case if you're actually sitting on the FOMC.
That's right. Let's assemble the panel to get their take on another important news day. Jeannie Shanzano is with us. Of course, Bloomberg Politics contributor, Democratic analyst, joined today by Republican strategist Lisa Camuso-Miller, the former RNC communications director and host of the Friday Reporter podcast. What's your take here, Jeannie? Goldilocks is a word we keep throwing around. The fact of the matter is a slowing job market, not exactly the greatest story for the White House to be telling, is exactly what they want, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And I think you could hear it in both your great interview with Heather Boucher and Julie Sue's comments. You can hear they are elated by this report. It is all good news. I mean, it was only, just a few days ago, people were saying we wouldn't see a cut until after the election. Now the possibility it may come earlier has opened up. So that is all good news for the White House. From a campaign perspective, I think the Biden campaign, and I know they will, has to keep their eye on the ball. You cannot tell people about good numbers. That is not going to work. So yes, all of his supporters and everything else, they know these numbers are good. But for the people on the ground in these key 7 states, this is more about talking about what Donald Trump has said. CNBC, he says he's going to cut Social Security. That has to go out. They have to be focusing on the threat Donald Trump is to the economy, not trying to sell Joe Biden's accomplishments. Let the data speak for itself and talk about the threat that is looming if people vote for Donald Trump, rather. That's the campaign strategy.
Well, certainly when the data was looking better than it is now, when we were talking of payrolls growth north of 300,000 plus, he still wasn't getting credit for the economy. So I understand that sentiment. Jeannie, does that mean, Lisa, for Republicans, the economy is going to be the best issue? If Biden can't talk about it or talk about it well enough, frame it well enough for voters to actually give him credit for it, then that's all opportunity to the other side?
Absolutely, Kaylee. I mean, I think more than anything, Jeannie took the words right out of my mouth. I mean, regardless of how good the numbers are, you can't tell people how the economy is performing if they don't feel that way. And so that's why we talk about consumer sentiment and we talk about a variety of other things, because that's really the way that people approach Election Day, right? So Republicans will be doing everything they can to define and continue to define this White House as not being good on the economy, even though the data says otherwise. And so this is the word versus word game that's going to happen between now and November in a way that's going to get harder and more difficult to navigate. So sure, in the playbook for Republicans, it's to talk about how Joe Biden's not great for the economy. And in the playbook for the Democrats, they're going to do the same and talk about how Donald Trump is not doing, would not do what he needs to do in order to continue to grow it.
Well, so let's distill this conversation into a simple question, Jeannie Shansano. Does Joe Biden need interest rate cuts to win re-election?
You know, they would be amazing, Joe Matthew. That would be great. He's hoping for them. You know, he would probably tell you he doesn't need them. He can't control them. The economy, of course, is going to matter. But again, there is no majority out there just so excited to vote for Joe Biden. So the way they have to frame this electorally is Donald Trump the threat to everything Joe Biden has achieved. And, you know, it's hard for us not to talk about our own individual accomplishments, which is what this campaign wants to do. And Joe Biden, look, I did this, this, and this. Stop it. Don't talk about what you've done. Talk about what the other guy will do. You're the incumbent. This is a referendum on you. He is a threat to what you've achieved, but you got to stop talking about achievements and focus on threat. There's no plainer way to say it. And they have the benefit of it, you know, having an opponent who should keep his mouth shut and let the attention be on Joe Biden, but always wants to talk about himself. So let him.
And of course, he's in court again today. We'll probably hear from him as he's walking out at the end of the proceedings today, as usual. Jeannie Shansano and Lisa Camusa-Miller will be sticking with us. We have much more to discuss with them, including, Joe, another big problem for President Biden. The economy is not the only issue on the list for this incumbent president. Increasingly, it is his policy toward Israel and the ramifications of that, including what we have seen playing out on college campuses across the country. 2,300
arrests now on campuses around the country. It's a remarkable headline, Kaylee, and we'll get into this coming up a little bit more as well. And also the Veep Stakes is getting hot this weekend in Palm Beach. We've got a lot to talk about with the panel coming up straight ahead.
Indeed we do, on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's 1:20 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got stocks pushing higher at Jobs Friday, and the jobs report this morning is putting a September Fed rate cut in play. S&P right now up 61, 51.25 is where we stand, up 1.2%. Dow Industrials up 444, up 1.2%. And we've got the NASDAQ Composite Index up 313 for NASDAQ. That is a gain there of just about 2%. Bottom line here, equities wiping out the week's losses, 10-year at 4.51%. The 2-year right now, 4.81%. Spot gold is declining by $6 the ounce to $22.97, down 0.3%. And West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.8%, $78.35 for a barrel of WTI. Cannot ignore the move in Bitcoin right now, up 5.2%. Bitcoin, 61,800 on Bitcoin. So again, recapping, equities are advancing. Apple after earnings up 6.9%, and Amgen shares soaring 12.5% after its CEO said he was very encouraged by early results from a study of the company's experimental obesity drug, Maritide. Again, we've got Amgen up by 12.6%. S&P up 62, up 1.2%. Balance of power continues now. And once again, your hosts, Kaylee Lyons and Joe Matthew.
Charlie Pellet, many thanks. Welcome to the Friday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm with Charlie Pellet here at World Headquarters in New York, and Kaylee is with us live, of course, from Washington, D.C., though we're all watching Palm Beach for the weekend. Kaylee, this is going to be quite the episode of The Apprentice, with basically everyone on the so-called short list, even though it's a long one, for a potential vice presidential pick for Donald Trump, and he's packed the party with major donors.
Yeah, I mean, we always talk about different shows that Washington, or the politics that dominate Washington, is reminiscent of. And this is literally Veep meets The Apprentice, because this is how the Veep stakes are going to play out. Doug Burgum, Tim Scott, J.D. Vance, others who are vying to be Trump's VP, all going to be down in Florida. And I'm imagining this will be as dramatic and drawn out as possible. On that note, let's bring back our political panel, Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributor, and Lisa Camusa Miller, former RNC communications director, Republican strategist, host of the Friday Reporter podcast. So, Lisa, I guess first question to you. I understand that Donald Trump is fundraising off this idea that people can help him select a VP. There's been a lot of drama and attention around it. But ultimately, what is a VP selection to someone like Donald Trump, who so dominates the spotlight? What kind of compliment is he really looking for?
You know, he's got a really smart team around him, and that makes a lot of people that are not necessarily Donald Trump fans concerned. But I suspect that those smart advisors are telling him that he should identify someone that's in a state that Trump perhaps really needs, that he's in, that he or she, whoever the vice president is someone that can speak to audiences that maybe Donald Trump does not appeal to. And so from that perspective, my vote is, not my vote, or my guess would be on him finding a female and someone that can talk more openly to middle-class female audiences that perhaps are not necessarily in favor of him because of some of that's gone on with the women's health issues, of the variety of them that have come up over the course of the last several months and years. So that, to me, would be conventional wisdom. That to say, I've also heard that he's going to pick someone that's from his home state. So, and by home state, I mean Florida. So, you know, all convention goes out the window, you know, you guys. I mean, this is like a whole new set of rules. But the way the choices used to be made is that they would identify someone that maybe covered the flanks, that were a little bit more open, and would provide more support for the candidate. This is not necessarily our usual game. And Kaylee, well put, Veep plus Apprentice. They're all fired, and this whole thing is crazy.
We're spending time with our great panel, Jeannie Sheehan Zaino and Lisa Camusa Miller, and I want our listeners and viewers to know that we're going to be treated by a great interview coming up in a couple of minutes with our colleague Anne-Marie Hordern, who, of course, is here in New York, and we'll be talking with a member of Parliament, Alex Burkhart, coming up a couple of moments from now. Kaylee, I must have missed something. I didn't hear you mention Kristi Noem. I guess the governor of South Dakota is not going this weekend?
I think Puppygate, or maybe she would call it Working Dog Gate, might have gotten the better with.
Well, so I'm wondering, Lisa, what do you make of this whole thing? Kristi Noem not invited to Florida as she tries to clean up the reaction to her story of shooting the family dog dead. Are we disqualified now?
If I had $5, I'd say she's the top nominee. I mean, he's going to raise money. He's going to do everything he can. This is the way Donald Trump has operated over the course of the last 10 years. We've seen him. He takes opportunities and uses them to his advantage. So he has set up the dance card with a whole variety of candidates that are going to be down at West Palm. But maybe there's another show in the wings that comes up where Kristi Noem comes back online. Because don't forget, she had that dynamite ad that they had running during it was the Super Bowl, I think, and there's some other things that were happening where she has been really smart about the way that she's positioned herself. So yes, the dog story is not great, being the owner of many dogs. But I will say this, it also was it was kind of noise even for Mitt Romney about putting the dog on the top of the station wagon. It's not the kind of thing that stops the process. Yeah, it's a stutter start for her, but I still think if you had $5 to bet, that's where my money is. I think Kristi Noem is still the leader. In the Veep running.
Wow. Well, her book comes out on Tuesday, where this dog story and many others will actually be. She's going to be doing the whole media circuit to promote that book, so I expect we'll hear a lot more from her in the coming days. I want to go back, though, Jeannie, to something Lisa was hinting at earlier, which is that she's heard that ultimately the VP pick might also be from Florida. We could have 2 Florida men potentially on the ticket. What are your thoughts on who Trump used to call Little Marco Rubio?
Yeah, there's a lot of questions about that. One of them is, is that even possible given they're from the same state? Is Marco Rubio going to have to flee the state if he's chosen? I don't see him choosing a Floridian. I was frustrated to see the short list the other day because of something Lisa was talking about. No women on that short list after Kristi Noem shot Cricket and then the goat. So, that is a frustration. Even Elise Stefanik appeared to be off that short list. Maybe they'll get resurrected. But it seems to me now what we're looking at is Tim Scott, J.D. Vance, and, Doug Burgum up there in North Dakota fighting off the South Dakota governor. And, one problem that Kristi Noem has is the issue of abortion. Donald Trump needs to choose somebody. If it's a governor, it should not be a governor with a state like Kristi Noem's where abortion is so restricted. That's a big problem for him. So a lot of things for him to consider as he tries to tease this out. But I hope a woman comes back on the short list.
Well, it's going to be interesting to watch, Kaylee. I'm assuming he's not going to fire them one by one through the process of elimination. We'll arrive at a vice presidential pick, but maybe we'll find out a little more this weekend in Palm Beach. That's Lil Marco, by the way, L-I-L apostrophe if we go back to 2016, thanks to our great panel, Jeannie Sheehan Zaino and Lisa Camuso Miller. I'm Joe Matthew in New York. Kaylee Lines is in Washington. Coming up, we're going to spend some time with Jessica Kavanaugh of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace with the latest on a potential ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Right now, it's a pleasure, though, to bring in my colleague here in New York, Anne-Marie Hordern, with an important conversation we've been looking forward to. A member of Parliament is with us here at World Headquarters, Alex Burkhart, and Anne-Marie will hand things over to you.
Thank you so much, Joe. That's right. I'm joined by Alex Burkhart, UK Cabinet Office Minister, leading on AI in the public sector. I want to start out with your role in artificial intelligence. This role wouldn't exist even as 2-3 years ago when I used to live in the United Kingdom. We've seen this government, led by the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, really want to invest and hone AI, even within the government. I know you're in the beta mode of this red box. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing, what you're focused on, and how the government could potentially harness this.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Thank you for having me on. And it's great to be in New York to talk about the work we're doing in the UK government at the moment. As you've said, the Prime Minister is really passionate about AI. We held the first AI Safety Summit that the world has seen last year, very, very productive. But the work that I'm doing is on how we can deploy AI for the public good. And that means how we can, it was about 18 months ago, we sat down and said, this new technology is emerging, potentially one of the great leaps forward. How are we going to harness it to improve the quality of public services and drive down costs for the taxpayer? And there's a number of ways in which that's emerging. And the first is that you can now automate tasks like never before. And I have, you mentioned Red Box, which is named after the red ministerial box that British ministers carry around.
I still hope they'll do that for show in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And but what we now have, what we've been building, is a tool that can summarize huge documents very, very quickly, that can relate them to what's been going on in Parliament, what's been going on in the press, and can pull out kind of key points that ministers need to focus on. And that's saving my private office hundreds of hours. But it's also starting to build a tool that is going to create institutional memory, recreate institutional memory in our government departments. So, when we're starting out on a project, we'll be able to ask, have we tried something like this before? Why didn't we carry on with it? What was good about it? And so that huge resource of documentation that's currently lying unused in government is going to come back into play.
So two questions immediately come to mind. One, talent, and the other, security. Let's start with talent first. If you work in AI, you can get paid handsomely going to, say, OpenAI. How do you attract that talent to, say, come work as a civil servant?
It's a great question. We were really worried about this at the start because we can't pay that money. And I've got a really great head of the program, Laura Gilbert, who's out in New York with me at the moment. And she said, as long as we can pay something, a bit more than we pay our normal civil servants, what we have is data. We have really good data, lots of centralized data. And if you are, an AI addict, if you're one of these super smart, crazy clever people who wants to get involved, the thing you want to play with is data. And so we've been looking at huge quantities of data and things like public prescriptions, health service, looking how we can improve the quality of prescriptions, drive down cost. We've been looking at how we can eliminate fraud and error in the benefit system. We have £280 billion benefit and pension system, and we currently employ thousands and thousands of people to check for fraud. We think we're going to be able to vastly reduce that and improve.
So attracting that talent hasn't been an issue?
No, we've been really pleasantly surprised that loads of people have applied and they've passed our very, very stringent tests to get in.
The one concern as well is security. You put all of this now, documents that live in a cloud, you're working more with AI. How do you safeguard that to, say, adversaries?
Yeah, it's a central question. We have a very effective security service in the UK, and we're constantly learning from partners. I was out in Tallinn in Estonia, right on the fringes of NATO a few weeks ago, learning from them because they were party to some enormous cyber attacks a few years ago and have become very, very resilient. So it's uppermost in our mind when we're vetting people, but also when we're building systems to make sure that they're not, they can't be attacked by enemy operators.
If you use AI in the defense sector in the UK government, how important is it that all that technology comes in-house, not out of house?
Well,
because of these concerns.
No, I think it's not just defense, right? When we were starting out, we could easily have gone and picked a number of big companies, big UK companies who have fantastic AI sector in London. But we wanted to understand this technology ourselves. So we've hired this crack team of 30 people, going up to 70, who are going to be able to build bespoke systems for us. Now, in the future, I think there'll be a case of some stuff we will build ourselves and use many times. Some stuff we will build bespoke for particular departments, perhaps like defense, and some things we will buy in. But having people who actually know how it works and know what government's needs are, I think is central to getting this revolution right.
I know you're in New York, so you're missing all the morning press in the UK after a critical election last night. And, you saw the bellwether parliamentary seat that the Conservatives lost. Do you honestly think the Conservative Party, if the elections are going to be held this year at some point, I know the Prime Minister said at the second half of the year, do you think the current Conservatives will be able to hold on to power?
I do think they will be able to, and I'll tell you why. Look, we've had a tough night. The truth is that in 2021, when this cycle of elections was last on, it was we had a vaccine bounce. That was a very good year for us. We always suspected we might come down. But there is a silver lining to this cloud, and it's the fact that Ben Houchin, our mayor in Teesside in the northeast, traditionally quite a deprived part of the country, which under the Conservatives is now flourishing. He's won, he's held on, he's done a very good job there. And I think when it comes to the election, and people actually have to make a choice about who they want to see in power for the next 5 years, is it going to be the Prime Minister and the Conservatives that has got us through COVID, that has seen off inflation and the energy crisis and has a plan for the future, or is it going to be a Labour Party that really has no plan and no agenda? I think they're going to come with us.
Do you now regret, though, potentially removing Boris Johnson just from an electability point of view?
No, I don't, because Boris certainly had his strengths, but things weren't working out, and he made some mistakes, and we couldn't have pretended that those mistakes hadn't happened.
Besides AI, which I know the Prime Minister is really focused on, but a lot of that feels a little bit like it's not tangible yet to voters and the electorate. What does Rishi Sunak need to do? Number one thing he needs to do going into this election?
So I think there are some really good stories to tell. I mentioned Teesside up in the northeast. When I was the Minister for Skills, I was lucky enough to be part of this great piece of work where Ben Houchin, the mayor, persuaded the energy companies to come in and build hydrogen plants on the condition that they offered training courses for young boys and girls in the local colleges. So you have, the government setting up a free port in Teesside, the mayor bringing in the business, and then the business securing the training places so that young people get those new jobs in their community. And that is what we call levelling up in the UK. And we're starting to see the fruits of it. New business in towns which have been left behind, and local people getting those jobs and adding to the prosperity of the places where they live. That's something that didn't happen under 13 years of Labour. It's happening under the Conservatives, and I've been proud to be part of it.
Do you want to break some news? Do you know when the election will be?
Well, I'd love to tell you, but the Prime Minister...
You don't know yet?
I don't know yet.
Okay. All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. That was Alex Burkhart, UK Cabinet Officer Minister, leading on AI in the public sector. Joe, Kaylee?
Anne-Marie Hordern, live in New York. Thank you so much for the great conversation, Anne-Marie. On the Friday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and Radio, I'm Joe Matthew in New York. Indeed, Kaylee is in Washington. An important conversation ahead with Jessica Kavanaugh of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace as we turn our attention to the potential for a ceasefire in Gaza. First, we want to get to Wall Street. On this Jobs Day, Charlie Pellet standing by with an update on the markets. Charlie?
We're going to end the week with a gain, Joe Matthew. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all advancing right now, with the S&P at 5127, up 62 points now, up by 1.2%. We've got the Dow Industrials up 463, up 1.2%. NASDAQ higher by 310. That is an advance right now of just about 2%. Wall Street taking a slowdown in the job market as an indication that the Fed will be able to start cutting rates as early as September. Traders sending stocks up sharply. Bond yields fell. The 10-year right now at 4.50%. The 2-year 4.80%. Spot gold down $3.50 the ounce, down 0.2%. $23.99 on gold. West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.7%, 78.38, and Bitcoin surging 5.4%, 61,900 right now on Bitcoin. Also helping sentiment, Apple. It is higher after posting stronger than expected sales last quarter, and it is predicting a return to growth in the current period, sparking optimism that a slowdown is easing. Apple shares after earnings now up by 7%. Recapping, bottom line, stocks higher on this Jobs Friday. S&P up 63, up 1.3%. Balance of Power continues now. Back we go once again. Kaylee Lyons and Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. Markets certainly celebrating today's jobs data, and the White House seems to be pretty happy with it as well. We heard from the White House, of course, with the member of the Council of Economic Advisors, Heather Boushey, earlier this hour. This is something that perhaps the administration is trying to hang their hats on, Joe, the continued strength, it seems, of the U.S. economy. But, of course, they're facing a number of other headwinds as well, as we continue to see campus protests, pro-Palestinian protests across the country and abroad, still efforting a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas that to this point has not yet come to fruition.
Well, that's true, Kaylee. You and I started this week on Monday with talk of an imminent announcement like that day or night, and it's been 5 days and we're still waiting. So now a new clock is ticking An important headline this morning in the Wall Street Journal: Israel gives Hamas a week to strike a deal on a Rafah, or rather a Rafah offensive will begin. And it gets us back to this idea, of question at least, whether Rafah is a bargaining chip or indeed something that Israel is telegraphing will happen. Kaylee, we're lucky to be joined by Jennifer Kavanaugh right now, Senior Fellow in the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And it's great to have you with us, Jennifer. We have a lot of questions about what's happening right now, including the status of talks now that a Hamas delegation is joining the situation in Cairo. What do you expect to happen this weekend?
Well, I heard the same report that you did, that Hamas has indicated that they are willing to continue negotiations. So there's still a chance for a deal. But there are a number of stumbling blocks, one of which you just mentioned, which is the fact that Netanyahu has made it clear that the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, intends to move on Rafah whether or not there is a deal, which really reduces Hamas's incentive to strike any sort of accord, given that it doesn't seem to buy them anything in the long term. Of course, the other stumbling block is the lack of a real plan for the future of Gaza. What happens if this is not a long-term ceasefire, or if it is, to Gaza in the long term? And those are things I think that are likely weighing on the minds of Hamas leaders as they're going into these negotiations.
Well, so Jennifer, it's interesting that you raised the incentives or perhaps lack thereof for Hamas, knowing that perhaps Israel will be moving into Rafah either way, that if they release hostages, they are losing some of the leverage that they have remaining. Why would Hamas agree to a temporary ceasefire at this point?
Well, it's possible that they would see an advantage to having some time to rebuild their forces or to solidify their grounds before Israel moved in. So it's possible that that is one way they're thinking. Another is that this idea that even a temporary ceasefire could become permanent. There have been some who have indicated that even on the Israeli side, there's a recognition that a temporary ceasefire would likely be a permanent one. So there's the potential that that Netanyahu's threat to move on Rafah, regardless of a deal, is just that, it's a bluff, and that what starts as a temporary ceasefire would become permanent. But that raises a whole host of other questions about what that means for the long term. And there's a lot of uncertainty for Hamas. Another big news item this week was this idea of a Israeli-Saudi normalization deal. And it's hard to see how that moves forward without a plan for a permanent Palestinian state. But Israel has indicated that it's not interested in moving in that direction either. So from Hamas's perspective, there's definitely an incentive to keep the talks going in hopes that they can delay any sort of further military operation. But it's hard to see what the incentives are for actually striking that deal without a lot more information and give on the Israeli side.
Jennifer, does the arrival potentially this weekend, is what we're hearing, of a temporary pier to deliver humanitarian aid to Gaza, the U.S. military, of course, building that as we speak, does it change the dynamic at all in these talks? Does it increase the chance for a ceasefire once it's up and running?
I'm not sure that really factors in all that much. I mean, the most efficient way to get aid into Gaza is with trucks over land borders. So the pier will offer some temporary relief, possibly. But even if that aid starts arriving this weekend, it's going to face delays in actually getting into the hands of population, because it's still not really clear how that aid is going to get from the pier to the population. And the big bottlenecks are the security checks of that aid as it moves from the pier onto land. And there's no protocol yet or procedures that have been outlined for how that process is going to occur that's going to be faster than what's already been put in place. So I'm not sure that that factors in, although it certainly would be beneficial for the Gaza population in the long term to be able to get access to more aid.
Well, you raised the question of perhaps bottlenecks that could arise once things are off the pier. There's also just the question of the security of the pier itself. This is something that the Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, was asked about earlier in Honolulu, and this was his response.
The first question was regarding any credible information that we have that Hamas is going to attack our troops. Of course, I don't discuss intelligence information at the podium, but I don't see any indications currently that there is an active intent to do that. Having said that, Phil, this is a combat zone, and a number of things can happen, a number of things will happen.
A number of things, Jennifer, he said, can and will happen. Could this pier be something of an impetus for actual U.S. troops getting involved in a more material way if indeed there were to be an attack?
Well, there's certainly the risk that could happen. That's one of the criticisms that has arisen of the plan for this pier since the start is that it's not clear how U.S. troops are going to be protected and how they're going to keep them from being on the land, which then could signal a larger U.S. role in this conflict than the Defense Department has indicated it intends to have or that it wants to have. One of Hamas's goals has been throughout this conflict to separate Israel from its Western support. So attacking U.S. forces and sort of forcing this decision of how in Israel's camp is the United States willing to be certainly could be a tactic. And so attacks on the pier are certainly not out of the question in terms of trying to force the U.S. hand in that way. At the same time, I don't think any player involved in this conflict, whether it's the United States, Hamas, Iran, Israel, wants to see an escalation to any sort of regional conflict. Hamas certainly would like to have de-escalation, not escalation, and so that could weigh on the other side of keeping them from putting any pressure on U.S. forces.
Jennifer, what happens if, as some are predicting, Israel opens a new front to the north? What happens to talks with Hamas if Israel attacks Hezbollah?
Well, I mean, that's a tough question, but I think the better question is whether or not Israel can really resource a second front without additional U.S. support. And my estimate is probably not. If Israel decides to open a second front, that opens a number of hard questions for the United States about how far it's willing to lean in terms of providing offensive military equipment to the United States, to Israel. And that's already been a contentious issue in the United States, with some senators calling for conditions on aid. And putting pressure on President Biden to come out more strongly in terms of leaning on the leverage that the United States gains from providing military aid in terms of reining Netanyahu in to limit this conflict, to prevent it from becoming a regional one, which is a real risk if Israel were to move into Lebanon.
Well, Jennifer, as you talk about the idea of limiting aid, certainly there is a chunk of people in the U.S. right now, including some members of Congress, who would not like to see the U.S. continuing to provide unconditional aid to Israel because of concern around Palestinian life and what's happening in Gaza. And certainly that has shown up on college campuses across the country, as we have seen what was a pro-Palestinian movement perhaps morphing into something that could have more anti-Semitism involved. What effect do you think the visuals and the rhetoric around these protests is actually having with the situation, or on the situation on the ground in the Middle East? Is that something that emboldens Hamas? Does it embolden Israel, make them more secure in the notion that they have to fight vigorously for their right to exist? How do you view that?
I could see it as possibly emboldening Hamas in the sense that it is eroding the global credibility and reputation of both the United States and Israel, which is one of the long-term goals of these groups. For Israel, seeing global protests against the way the war has been conducted certainly helps shift public opinion against them and limit their flexibility to continue the war. And for the United States, it raises questions about a double standard. Some countries across the global south especially have been very critical of what they see as a double standard between the way the United States has responded to Israel's conduct of its war in Gaza and Russia's conduct of its war in Ukraine, which the United States has come out very strongly against. Now, there are obviously very significant differences between those two conflicts, But that connection has been made, and that narrative, which has been fueled by disinformation and by Russian sources and by anti-Israel sources, has taken hold, and that can have an impact on U.S. influence across places in Africa and other parts of the Middle East as well.
All right, Jennifer Kavanaugh, great to have you on Balance of Power today. Thank you so much for joining us. She, of course, is a senior fellow in the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We want to turn now to David Weston, the host of Bloomberg Wall Street Week, who will be talking about the campus protests on the program today with Larry Summers, not just former U.S. Treasury Secretary, but also, of course, the former president of Harvard University. But there's another narrative that Larry Summers, I'm sure David had to be asked a lot about, and that's the fact that this is a jobs day today.
Yeah, indeed. And Larry did want to talk about the campus protests. He called it craven, actually, what Harvard had done. He said he hasn't been this appalled. He can't remember ever having been this appalled with his home Harvard. So he was very upset about that. But a lot of the discussion was with him about jobs and about where we are in the economy, and his concern that still Chair Jay Powell may be just a little too sanguine about where we are. There's a lot of data that came out, as you know, Kaylee, this week that pointed in different directions. But he said he's not as convinced as Jay Powell was that we really are restrictive, and there are some indications to think that inflation's not going away.
We were talking to Heather Boucher a little earlier in the hour, David, and boy, it's difficult, obviously, to get an answer from the White House when it comes to interest rates and Fed policy, and we were trying to walk that line, but they really are reluctant to say that this is a soft landing, knowing that so much could change between now and November.
Well, you know, it's interesting, Joe. Larry's very specifically said there's still a possibility of a soft landing. There's still a possibility of no landing, that basically we don't get back even close to 2%, given where we are. There are some structural factors he's concerned about, and he talked about that. So he thinks it's way too soon to tell. And one thing he said is we got, as you know, a lot of information. The ECI numbers came out, and we had the Powell news conference, the Fed decision, we had the jobs decision. He said sometimes you can learn more and not know anymore. He said we learned a lot, but we don't know anything more at the end of the week than we did at the beginning of the week.
That's something.
Well, and I'm sure we have a lot more to learn, and that the next CPI print we get will be just as important in shaping the way the Fed views things as this jobs data today was. When we heard from Chair Powell earlier this week, David, he was asked a question about how he thinks about the timing of rate cuts in the election, the political context around it. He basically said, we don't think about that at all, but I would imagine Wall Street's actively thinking about that.
Well, and as you know well, Kaylee, Wall Street doesn't really quite believe him because Wall Street thinks it cannot be the case. They can't take it into account. But they say this very consistently. Jay Powell has always been consistent in this. I talked to Mary Daly a couple months ago and really pushed her on this. She said, honest to goodness, we do not think about the political consequences of it. At the same time, the one thing, Joe and Kaylee, I think that the White House has got to be very concerned about is they were hoping for some job cuts well in advance of that election. That looks less and less likely. It would be a nice thing, wouldn't it, for the president to come and say, look, we got all these rate cuts and things are really going well. And in fact, it doesn't look like that's likely to happen at the moment.
We've started asking questions about whether he can win re-election without them, David, knowing that this campus protest issue and so many other things are dragging him down. The wind at his back from Jay Powell would help a lot.
Yeah, no kidding. And at the same time, he's got to really address the inflation issue. I mean, even today, his statement comes out and says, look at all these jobs we've created, which the American people, I'm sure, say, well, that's nice to have jobs, but look at the prices. Look at the prices at the grocery store. Look at the prices at the pump. And it's very hard to get past that. I mean, in fact, as you know, Glenn Youngkin gave an interview, actually, to one of our colleagues over in Europe, and I thought he laid out sort of the Trump case. Under Trump, it was low inflation and high growth. Now we've got low growth and high inflation. You know, as we say in the biz, QED. That which is to be proven has been proven. Now, I think that's way oversimplistic. I don't think that's fair. But it's going to be hard, I think, for the Biden camp to really turn that narrative around.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week, 6 p.m. Washington time, he says, as he stands in New York. What a treat to be in the same room as David Weston. Aren't you jealous, Kaylee? And I'm not only here with David, I'm also here with Tim and Carol, because it's almost time for Bloomberg Business Week.
It's a
What do you
full
like?
house here.
There are no chairs left in here, guys. We'll let you have your studio. What do you have coming up later?
We're going to talk more about the economic backdrop and talk about the jobs report this morning. The difficult spot, it's just so funny. I mean, yeah, amazing that the predicament maybe the White House
How much, Tim, is this rally? Apple or jobs?
I think it's more jobs. Yeah. Apple's
and the
not
rate
hurting it.
The rate rethink, right?
Yeah, pulled back because of the jobs report.
Kaylee, I'll meet you 5 o'clock on Balance of Power, right back here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very happy Jobs Friday, everybody. Welcome to Bloomberg Business Week. Carol Masser, Tim Stenivek, live on radio, TV, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals. And let's get to the setup on this Friday, May 3rd. It's another reset, Tim, it looks like, when it comes to rates.
Yeah, Treasury's surging off another, well, I should say today's softer employment report. This is U.S. jobs post the smallest gain in 6 months, Carol.
Yeah, exactly. So that is certainly top of mind. On that, folks, we're going to get Chicago Fed President Austin Goolsby's view and really highlight what you need to know about the release specifically this morning and really those new trader expectations around rate moves. Yes, again, they've changed. Again, like volatility seems to be the one thing we can count on when it comes to the U.S. Treasury trade.
What about volatility when it comes to the jobs market? We're going to be speaking with the CEO of Heller Search on executive roles in the IT sector and what they can tell us about the broader economy.
Yeah, they've definitely seen some swings as well. Plus, talk about swings to the upside. Amgen soaring. It is the #1 gainer in the S&P 500, the #1 gainer in the NASDAQ 100. It's all about the prospect of another experimental weight loss drug, so we're going to dig into that one.
Also, still top of mind for us and for so many people around the country, what's happening on college campuses around the United States. We've got the author of Bankers in the Ivory Tower to talk about the intimate relationship between big finance and higher education.
Looking forward to that one. First up, though, let's get a check on your trade and your top business stories on this Friday. Here's Charlie Kelly.
Hi, thank you very much. And here's what's going on. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ 100 Index, Russell 2000, all surging. Apple up 7% after earnings. You alluded to Amgen. That stock right now up by 12.2%. We got the S&P up 65, a gain of 1.3%. Dow Industrials up 483, right now up by 1.3%. NASDAQ up 2%, and yes, the S&P 500 index on track for a second weekly gain in a row. 10-year 4.50% with a 2-year yielding 4.80% after the jobs report. Gold down $1.14 the ounce right now to $23.02, a drop there of just about 0.9%. West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.8%, 78.29 for a barrel of WTI. Right now we got oil on track for its biggest weekly decline since February on signs of easing geopolitical risks in the Middle East. Oil stocks moving lower as well today. Case in point, ExxonMobil now down 0.7%. ADRs of BP down by just about 0.1%, and Chevron tumbling 1.1%. Again, recapping, stocks are higher. Jobs Friday. Wall Street loved this morning's report. S&P up 65, up 1.3%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
There's your setup, folks, on this Friday, and just about 2 hours to go until the closing bell. Well, minutes, though, after that weaker than forecast U.S. jobs report came out, traders pulled forward expectations for the Fed's first rate cut to September from November. This is after rate expectations were managed down just on Wednesday, courtesy of a Fed meeting and that press conference with Chair Jay Powell.
So as for this morning's employment release, U.S. employers scaled back hiring in April, and the unemployment rate unexpectedly rose, suggesting that some cooling is underway in the labor market after that strong start that we've seen to the year. President of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, Austin Goolsby, talking earlier with Bloomberg's Michael McKee.
175,000 is a very solid report. Some of the root of our frictions here might be there's a kind of a day trader's timetable and there's an economic timetable. For setting monetary policy, of course, you got to take a longer arc view on inflation, on employment.
All right, that is the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, Austin Goolsby, earlier with Bloomberg's Michael McKee, who joins us now from Stanford, California. He is at the Hoover Conference at Stanford University. And here in our New York studio, we have our own Bloomberg News rates reporter, Michael McKenzie. Michael McKee, I want to start with you. You're at the Hoover Conference in Stanford. I'm curious, you're talking to the right people about today's economic backdrop. Former St. Louis Fed President Jim Bullard called this morning's employment report solid but softer. How do you see it based on the numbers?
Well, it is solid but softer. There were many years where 175,000 a month would be considered really strong. It's just that we got used to coming out of the pandemic, numbers over 200,000-300,000, because companies were trying to refill their ranks as quickly as possible. And then we went from there to a very strong January, February, March that seems to be a bit of an outlier. And so now we're coming back into where the Fed and the markets think we should be, which is why everybody was so happy today.
All right, well, we know that certainly people are happy. It's reflected not just in the equity market, but also when it comes to the bond market. Mike McKenzie, come on in here, because I'm curious how you see it, because we're certainly seeing the way that traders in the rates market are reacting to it.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a tone of relief that began on Wednesday after Powell spoke, and you saw that this morning. At one point, the two-year yield had locked up a 30 basis point drop since Wednesday, biggest three-day move since the mid-December pivot from Powell. But that's kind of, the gloss has come a little bit off that. I mean, I think the market is now looking ahead to the refunding next week. We got a lot more supply coming, but also the market realizes that one payroll report doesn't really shift the dial that much.
Hallelujah.
And so we were pricing in 25 basis points in September for a cut, and we were pricing in 50 for this year, just after the number dropped at 8:30 this morning. We're now back to just pricing in 20 and 44. So this isn't a number that can get the market to say, hey, let's price in 2 cuts this year. Market still can't go there because it needs to see what the inflation report on the 15th of May looks like. It also needs, as Goolsbee also said, they're taking a longer view, which they do at the Fed, than the market does with its sort of short-term focus. But talking to a couple of big bond managers this morning, we'll probably get 2 cuts this year, maybe 3. Probably get inflation down
Today,
to 2.5.
they think that.
Yeah. And they're kind of sitting there in the 2-year, 3-year saying, this is how you got to play it. You just got to look at bonds now as they're going to give you some nice income, but you're not going to get the big capital returns that you were accustomed to when the Fed would do these big rate cuts in the past.
So, Mike McKee, come back in on here. Fed, one thing we know, they are data dependent, no doubt about it. And we've often talked with both of you about the importance of a trend line, and it's not just 1 month's data. So how does this set of data points, if at all, kind of change the Fed think here?
It doesn't change the Fed's thinking at all. It ratifies the idea that they might be on the right path, that policy is restrictive enough that the economy is slowing but not falling off a cliff. They're going to want to see a lot more data that suggests or that proves out that theory. But this at least gives them, and by then extension the markets, some sort of relief in the sense that after we saw these other big months of job gains plus the inflation rate starting to go up a little bit, that maybe we had started to go the wrong direction. Now this is a sign that maybe we're headed in the right direction. And we got the ISM reports yesterday, Wednesday and today, that also showed some weakness in the economy, which is what they expect. So if that's the case, they're going to be looking at this and saying, we're probably on the right course. We don't need to course correct at this point, and we will wait and see what additional data we get.
So, Mike, I am curious, there you are at the Hoover Conference at Stanford. Is there a general mood, a general thesis, a general theme about how people feel about this economy? Claudia Sahm earlier on Surveillance this morning said, you know, unless jobs moderate too much and the consumer slows down, maybe we do indeed get that soft landing.
Well, there are a lot of central bankers and ex-central bankers who attend this conference, and basically they all have about the same reaction, that the economy is in pretty good shape, that the U.S. economy is in much better shape than the rest of the world. The theme here is global central banks, but that we need to see more because we don't understand what's going on. And that's been the issue for the Fed and for other central banks. Coming out of the pandemic, so many of the rules were suspended, the historical lessons didn't apply. And we've had this back and forth now with strength in the job market and inflation. So what is causing all that? They don't really know. They think that monetary policy works and they're going to stick with it. But at this point, it's interesting to watch, and you can't bet on anything in particular that's going to happen. You heard Austin Goolsbee said there's 2 timelines, the long-term timeline they follow and the day trader timeline, and that's what you get. I mean, you get the Fed funds futures going back and forth, September, November, October, you know, and that's going to keep happening with every data point until the Fed can give them a better clue about what they're doing, which they can't do until they get better clues themselves.
Well, that's a great thing, because I think about even when we have a general market conversation, it's like everybody's like, yeah, but you got to think about the long term. But I'm like, yeah, but here we are today, and it's impacting markets. How do you make sense of this? And I love that you always bring in these conversations that you have with various traders, because there's the current trade, but I think about how that builds the longer term trade. So how do you think about this?
Well, I think hotter data, I mean, I think what's interesting is that Powell kind of set this up for an asymmetric reaction. In that he kind of took the rate hike off the table.
Yeah.
So when we were coming into today's payroll data, the view from a lot of people in the market was, if you get stronger numbers, you'll get a bit more selling, but not much. Because Powell, because he's taken that hike off the table now, 5% is the ceiling for 2s. Maybe we can test that area over time if the data remains stronger in 10s, but for pretty much in the front end, we've seen the high. But the flip side of that was if you get some weaker data, you're going to get a big reaction, and that's exactly what we got. But now, on the surface, 175 is the first miss in 6 months, big reaction, the day traders jump on that. But now they're sort of realizing 175 is still pretty good.
Yeah.
And yes, wages have moderated, but they're still not back to where we want to see them, so the Fed can then feel a little bit more confident that inflation is trending the right way. But when you step back from that, so you're going to have that kind of volatility from data point to data point.
Yeah.
But if you're a long-term investor right now, you're looking at the highest yields since 2007. And next week, if we get a bit more weakness in that 10-year, you're going to be taking down a 10-year and buying it with a 450 coupon. We saw that briefly last November. We hadn't seen that until 2007. So if you're taking the long view and you think the Fed has got this, will eventually prevail, and I think it's one of the great lines from Leon Cooperman said, if you don't think the Fed can achieve what it wants to achieve, we've got a real problem. And I think the bond market and long-term investors in particular now saying, we think the Fed has got this. It might take a bit longer, but in the meantime, if I can take down 10-year paper at 450 coupon,
why not?
Happy days.
Exactly. All right, guys, we got to leave it there. Thank you both so much for everything, especially like this week where we have just seen a lot of news on this front coming at us. Our thanks to, of course, our Mike McKee and our Michael McKenzie. All right, so that is our focus, right, when it comes to the macro eco. But there's one name in particular on the equity side of things that really has caught our attention too.
It's not Apple, even though Apple is higher following earnings. It's Amgen, because Amgen shares soaring up the most at its intraday high, going all the way back to 2009. This after the company's CEO said he was, quote, very encouraged by early results from a study of the company's experimental obesity drug called Maritide. With the details, back with us, Bloomberg News health reporter Madison Muller from Washington, D.C. What do we know, Madison, about Amgen's experimental drug and how far along they are? Because we're not just seeing reaction from Amgen today, we're also seeing Eli Lilly move lower in response.
Yeah, so what we know is not much because, like you mentioned, this drug is still in phase 2 development. So it's in mid-stage studies. It's not very far along. And really, the market is reacting to no data, like no new data. We have some early data that showed that this drug potentially could be taken less frequently than the very popular obesity drugs made by Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk. But really, the only thing that changed this week was the CEO of the company said on an earnings call with investors that he was encouraged by the early data and that they had been looking at an interim analysis and that things were going well so far.
Madison, it's the top performing name in the S&P 500 and I believe the NASDAQ 100 as well. It has been pretty much all day. I mean, it is up almost 12% here. All right, so you look at this space, because it's interesting. Tim and I were talking in the newsroom because Eli Lilly went down, Novo went down a little bit, although I think it's off its lows. Why the reaction? And I wonder about Lilly. Is everybody just kind of, for lack of a better word, kind of gunning for Lilly?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you wouldn't think that, it just like shows the competitiveness of this space, I guess. We were talking about this earlier this week, what other companies are in the pipeline and are potentially coming for Lilly and Novo, and Amgen is one of those companies. And the crazy thing is that it's further behind than some other companies, but investors are so excited about this drug because of this potentially less frequent dosing. It's differentiated from the other products that are out there. And so it is just so closely watched. And like any excitement from one of these other companies is kind of going to look bad for Lilly and Novo at this point, which is, it's just crazy.
Madison, I think it also says something about the industry and where we are in the industry when it comes to pharmaceuticals, that this is sort of seen right now as the hottest thing to address, to treat. Look at what investors have done to Novo and Lilly shares over the last 18 months as a result of these drugs. What does it say to you about the investor community that Amgen shares can soar this much on that one comment?
Right. I mean, it's just, we were talking about this a little bit earlier today, like investors are just looking for ways to get in on this market, especially because Lilly is so expensive right now. And so if there are other ways to get in on this extremely hot obesity market, Amgen is one of those options because it's a little bit cheaper. And so this is sort of seen as an opportunity to get in on this, outside of Lilly and Novo.
It's interesting. You know, I don't know if you saw earlier in the week the big take. It was, I'm sure you did, about Novo Nordisk and its impact on the Denmark, its economy. I mean, Novo Nordisk, excuse me, Europe's most valuable company, the market cap of about 570 billion, bigger than the Danish economy, but just talked about the impact that it has on that country. It's just amazing, like the size of these companies. When you do look at the market cap size, not the market cap, but the size or potential market of this drug, especially as I feel like every conversation we have with you, it's like, well, wait, it can maybe do this and it can maybe do this. And, you know, is this going to be the fix-all for so much of what ails us? I mean, is there enough to have multiple players? Will there be distinctions between the drug that are better for certain people? Like, how are you thinking about this market longer term?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And it's the potential here is huge. Like we've talked about the other indications, but the size of the population of people that could benefit from these drugs is just enormous. And then you think about the people that maybe don't fall into the category of obesity but are overweight. And we know from talking to AstraZeneca's CEO that AstraZeneca is looking at that population of people that isn't severely obese but might be on the lower end of the spectrum and just needs to lose a little bit of weight to get into the healthier range. And so there's like different thresholds of weight loss now that the companies are targeting, and that's one of the ways that they're differentiating themselves. Also looking at you know, what other like specific health benefits each drug helps with. So maybe one drug is better at helping with kidney issues, one of them is potentially better at helping with heart issues. And so that's like, there are all these small ways now that the companies are looking to differentiate themselves, and investors are looking at that too, right, with where are the potential opportunities in this market.
Hey, kiddo, we talked to you about a lot. 20 seconds. Is there one company that you really kind of think everybody should be watching? Or you can say all of them.
I mean, one of the ones that I've been watching is Viking, which we've talked about as well. It's a smaller biotech company. Definitely has been a name that's been thrown around for potential acquisition target for one of the larger pharmaceutical companies that does not have a weight loss drug right now. So I think that that's one to watch.
All right, good to know. And I'm just pulling it up on the Bloomberg. Viking Therapeutics, folks, up 315% this year. That's all. All right, going to leave it there. Madison Muller, you're the best. Have a great weekend. Health reporter here at Bloomberg News, joining us from our Washington, D.C. bureau.
Hey, still ahead, bankers in the ivory tower, the troubling rise of financiers in U.S. education. We talk with the author, Charlie Eaton. This is Bloomberg.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the U.S. stock market as measured by the S&P trading very close to session highs right now, on track for another winning week right now on the week, looking at a gain of just about 0.6%. The S&P right now up 69.51.33. That is a gain of 1.4%. Dow Industrials up 490, up now by 1.3%. NASDAQ up 2.1%. The 10-year 4.50%, with that 2-year yielding 4.80%. Spot gold is declining by $4 the ounce to $22.99, a drop there of 0.1%. And West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.9%, 78.23 for a barrel of WTI. Bitcoin up 5.3%, 61,875 right now on Bitcoin. The sharp rise in cocoa prices is leading to big gains at Hershey. The chocolate and salty snack company says first quarter sales and profit sailed past analyst estimates as it hiked prices in response to cocoa shortages. Hershey up now by 1.2%. Recapping, stocks are rallying after the jobs report. S&P up 69, gain there of 1.4%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Well, this week, pro-Palestinian protesters on U.S. campuses across the nation found themselves being arrested or shut down as colleges moved to slow their activities. Among the demands by activists, at least some of them, divestment from Israel and academic ties with the country, which brought up once again, at least for us, the relationship between money and academia. It's something we write about a lot here at Bloomberg. Bloomberg's Opinions, John Authors just today writing in a column that divestment has had some successes, but like the Israel-Palestine conflict itself, it is more complex than it looks. All right, we wanted to explore more, so let's get to our interview. We welcome Charlie Eaton. He's Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Merced, joining us from there. He is the author of Bankers in the Ivory Tower, The Troubling Rise of Financiers in U.S. Higher Education. Professor Eaton, we are so delighted to have you here with us on Bloomberg Business Week. You have looked extensively at how finance has played a central role in the widening inequality that we've seen in recent decades, both in American higher education, but also really kind of more wider American society at large. Money and academia, not a new idea. What exactly, though, is the relationship today and with all its dimensions?
Yeah, it's not the same at every university. Not every university is Harvard or Columbia or Princeton or even the University of California. But our wealthiest universities now have endowments that are valued in the tens of billions of dollars, and that connects them to every corner of the global economy. A lot of that is via hedge fund and private equity investments. The wealthiest endowments now invest more than 60% or sometimes even more than 70% of their endowments with private equity and hedge funds.
I wonder how that's different now than versus the 1980s, because something that we've been talking a lot about, Professor, over the last few weeks has been what happened on Columbia's campus, for example, during the 1980s when the students were protesting apartheid in South Africa. How has the relationship between money and education changed between then and now?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you go back to the 80s, very few of the endowments, even the wealthiest endowments, were investing with private equity and hedge funds. It starts in the 80s. A prominent story that was reported in the New York Times is that Tom Steyer, one of the first hedge fund founders, goes on to become a billionaire. He learns that David Swensen at the Yale Endowment is starting to use hedge fund investment techniques. And he spends a couple years trying to get David to invest in his hedge fund. He gets $300 million and he goes and he experiments in it. But David Swensen was nervous about doing that kind of investment because it was new and untested. But over the last 40 years, those endowments have grown through those kinds of endowments by an average of 10% average annual rate of return over the years. So that what the portfolio is invested in has really changed.
Well, what's most problematic about the relationship today? Is it just that it's heightened? Is it the amount of money involved, the financial entanglement? We just had a chart up showing, various endowments, you know, over 50 billion at Harvard, 40 at Yale, 34 at Princeton, 34 billion, 13 billion, almost 14 billion at Columbia, 21 at the University of Pennsylvania. Real money. These are big money. And, you know, when we inquire about them, you know, many say, well, this is what's required at an institution of this caliber and this size, if you will, to attract professors and the facilities. But I do wonder, these are big numbers, and I just wonder how, you know, the amount of money that's involved, this financial entanglement, what's most problematic about it in your view and from the research and analysis that you've done?
Yeah, there's two sides of it. I mean, one is, you know, are the things that endowments invest in, are they consistent with the values of the university? So, you know, questions like fossil fuel divestment have gotten at those kind of questions. But the other side of it is, what do the universities use the funds for? And if you look at the largest university endowments, they've gone up tenfold since the 1970s. Princeton's a good example because there's no law school, no business school there to complicate it. Their endowment's up tenfold, but they still enroll a similar number of undergraduate students to what they enrolled in the 70s. And what that means is, you go back to the 70s, they spent about $10,000 per year per student from the endowment to support university activities. Today, they spend about $100,000 per year per student from the endowment to support university activities. The question I ask is, would Princeton still be a world-class university if it enrolled twice as many students to serve more Americans from more walks of life and only spent $50,000 per year per student? So there's two sides of the question of, you know, how should endowments be managed and what should the funds be used for?
I wonder about the demands that protesters are making today. There are lots of different protests happening or were happening on campuses around the country, but in some cases, like at Columbia, for example, calling for the school to divest from companies that support the government of Israel or do business there, for example. I'm curious if that type of action would even be possible for an endowment given the complexity of endowments today.
Yeah, well, you know, Brown University and Northwestern University have recently suggested they can. The example of fossil fuel divestment has suggested that you can do some pretty complex divestment. I mean, I think we like to think of universities as innovative places, and we like to think of finance as an innovative sector that's a can-do sector where we can use technology and use innovation to be thoughtful about what we invest in. So, you know, at a certain level, I think there is a kind of can-do thing. If you get a little bit more brass tacks, you know, one thing is that particularly smaller endowments invest more of their portfolio with index funds and other passive funds. And there's a growing community of passive fund managers that use ESG, environmental, social, and governance principles for managing investments, and they use screens. There's over 300 such fund managers who screen out weapons manufacturers, for example.
Right.
So you do have private sector finance partners who you can work with to do this, and I think that's why some universities have expressed some openness to looking at what can be done and what should be done. I think the harder question is, what are your values? And how should you apply your values to your investing? It's not the technical question of how to do it.
Well, and I do wonder, you know, going back to those endowment sizes and the importance that these schools hold in terms of having relationships with big donors, major donors, and making sure that they can maintain that endowment. But what does it do to kind of who has the power in an academic economy?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, you know, another issue that your question gets at is the issue of transparency. Endowments have a culture and an institutional history of operating in the dark. They're managed by a chief investment officer with oversight from a board of trustees. And they often work with private equity or hedge fund managers who themselves value secrecy because that's part of the business. You're trying to beat the market. You're trying to use private information and your own smarts to outsmart the market, and you don't want others to know what your strategy is. So I think opening up your endowments to invest according to other principles, being more inclusive to students and community members who want to have a say in the endowment being managed according to their values, requires a shift in transparency in some of these practices that aren't how endowment managers have been built historically.
Hey, we have a couple, very briefly, yes or
We're
no?
gonna try.
Yes or no, because we only have 30 seconds left. Should the endowments be taxed based on your view, your research?
Yeah, I think that it depends on whether the endowment is being used sufficiently to serve enough students and students from all backgrounds. So, if a university uses its endowment to grow its enrollment, to serve all communities, then it should be tax exempt. If not, then I think there's reason to tax the endowment so that we can support students to go where there's not as much resources.
Is it tough to make sure that the right values are in place, especially when the board members are overwhelmingly, as you write about, drawn from the alumni who tend to donate most generously? And forgive us, but you've only got about 20 seconds, 25.
Yeah, I think it is tough, but universities are supposed to be places of innovation and ideas. And so I think reimagining the university and reimagining finance to be more inclusive and to give a say to our students and our community members is something that we're up to.
Professor, appreciate you taking the time. That's Charlie Eaton, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Merced. He joins us from Merced today. He's the author of Bankers in the Ivory Tower, The Troubling Rise of Financiers in U.S. Higher Education.
When we come back, folks, the CEO of Heller Search on IT jobs. First up, though, we check on world and national news, and back to Amy Morris we go. Hey, Amy.
Hey, Carol, an indictment was just unsealed today against Democratic Representative Henry Cuellar of Texas and his wife, indicted on conspiracy and bribery charges. As we get more on this, we're going to bring it right to you. Donald Trump's criminal hush money trial continues in New York City with former Trump advisor Hope Hicks on the stand. Hicks was present during key campaign discussions about the threat posed by the Stormy Daniels story. She testified the political firestorm that ensued after the release of the Access Hollywood tape was so strong, it dominated coverage for 36 hours leading up to Donald Trump's debate against Democrat Hillary Clinton. In New York, college officials warned protesters that tents set up on the SUNY New Paltz campus must be removed. When protesters refused, they were arrested. The president of that school says they are negotiating with protesters. Meanwhile, in California, the 210 pro-Palestinian protesters arrested at UCLA have been released from jail now. This protester says she doesn't regret anything.
I've never felt more proud of myself or my community.
The LA County Public Defender's Office says the protesters were booked into jail and cited but not charged with any crimes. Most of them are due back in court in July. And an Iran-backed Houthi militia group based in Yemen is threatening to attack ships in the eastern Mediterranean. They normally keep their attacks focused on vessels in the Red Sea. These are ostensibly against Israel over its war with Hamas. Global news 24 hours a day, whenever you want it, with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris. This is Bloomberg.
9:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Equities have wiped out this week's losses. We are on track for another winning week, 2 in a row. Wall Street taking a slowdown in the jobs market as an indication that the Fed will be able to start cutting rates as early as September. Here's where we stand. The S&P at 5129, up 65 right now, up 1.3%. Dow Industrials up 464. That is a gain of 1.2%. The Nasdaq Composite Index up 328, up now by 2.1%. S&P, by the way, holding close to session highs. 10-year, 4.50%, with a 2-year right now, 4.80%. Spot gold down $5 the ounce to $22.98, a drop of 0.2%. West Texas Intermediate crude oil down 1.1%, $78.05 a barrel. Bitcoin up 5.3%, 61,832 on Bitcoin. Also helping sentiment today, Apple.
All right, we're going to check in with Charlie, going to grab some water for him. You are listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week. Carol Massar along with Tim Stenovic. Quick check on the markets, just to remind you, on this Friday, this Jobs Friday, S&P 500 up 67 points, up about 1.3%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average up a 1.25%. And then you have the NASDAQ really outperforming, helped out largely by some of the large cap names, specifically Apple. The NASDAQ 100 is up about 2%.
Hey, bond market, big deal today, Carol. That's what you and I have been talking about throughout the program. We're seeing yields move lower across the curve right now. Not as low as they were just post that jobs report, but still in the 2-year, down 6 basis points. Then up there on the 10-year, now at 4.5% yield, down about 8 basis points on the day.
All right, so now, as we mentioned earlier, today's jobs report signaled further evidence that demand for workers is moderating. The monthly reading showing that U.S. jobs posted the smallest gain in 6 months. Meantime, employment also weaker in the service sector report that was published after the monthly jobs read. This later report by the Institute of Supply Management, combined with the jobs data, the figures represent a moderation in demand that may restrain economic growth. This is why we're all kind of seeing the rate kind of re-rate, if you will, in today's trade.
We got somebody here with a unique perspective on a group of workers that really a few years ago always seemed in demand, though until they weren't. We're talking about those folks in the IT space. We welcome to the program Martha Heller, founder and CEO of Heller Search. It's an IT executive recruiting firm specializing in CIOs, CTOs, VP-level senior tech leaders, and executive tech talent. She joins us from Boston. Good to have you with us, Martha. You deal on a very senior level. I think we got to get that out there. What are you seeing when it comes to IT executives, which again are up on the chain of command?
That's true. So thanks for having me. You know, I focus exclusively on the technology talent market. So this job report was not a surprise to me. We've been seeing massive layoffs in the technology sector for months now because these big companies, Microsoft, Meta, Google, they are reshaping themselves from IT providers to becoming AI businesses. So they are replacing teams of traditional engineers, technology leaders with data scientists, algorithm people, AI prompt engineers. So that is the primary reason we're seeing in the tech sector lots of layoffs. But we need to make sure we understand the difference between the tech sector and technology leadership talent. Every other company in the world that isn't a high-tech business needs traditional technology leaders. They're not ready to go full force into AI. So every time a Microsoft or a Facebook or Meta or Salesforce lays somebody off, that's good news for McDonald's and the NFL, and American Airlines.
That's so interesting you say that. Yeah, I talked to an employee at one of these firms just like years ago, and she was basically like, it's a little wild that people are still calling it the tech sector because everything is technology right now. It doesn't matter if you're in Silicon Valley. It doesn't matter if you have that tech DNA. You need to be in the tech space. But I am curious about where you're seeing movement right now. Are you seeing a reset because of this shift to AI, this idea that this is something, I mean, Carol and I were talking today earlier, JP Morgan out with a chat GPT-like service as of now. This is every company embracing this.
That's right. So you are exactly right. Software is eating the world, and every technology is becoming a technology company. But at the same time, some companies like JP Morgan in the financial services sector, they've been upgrading their technology and technology leadership for years. Their product is data. It's always been data. So they're ahead of the game. But many companies have not been upgrading their technology. They've got data in all different places. AI cannot learn on something that is not a concentrated data set. So JP Morgan can do a lot with AI because they've been upgrading their technology. There are a lot of companies, even though they say we're a technology company, they don't have the architecture, they don't have the data science, they don't have the engineering to really run AI.
You know, Martha, I'm listening to you, and yeah, we know that every company is a technology company, right? We've talked about this for years. And as you said, something like a JP Morgan, I mean, AI, not new, we all know that and stuff. It's just taking artificial intelligence, generative AI, LLMs, large language models. Like it's just a whole other level. And we're trying to really, you know, assess as we continue to see the investment spend, you know, how it changes our world. Some say it's going to be incredibly dramatic. Having said that, from your vantage point, here we are on a day where we see a job print that was actually softer than we've seen. And we're trying to assess what that tells us about, one, the labor market, and two, what that tells us about the economy going forward. So from your vantage point, what you are seeing with very senior level IT folks, what it says about the jobs market and kind of companies, what they are willing to spend on somebody maybe for those positions?
You know, and I would say what we will see in that future is haves and have-nots. There will be companies that are changing what they're doing wholesale based on AI. They are becoming AI-driven businesses. Those folks, those companies, they're going to hire, they're going to grow, their cultures will change dramatically, and then there will be companies that will be left out of the AI boom because they're not doing all of those things. And so I think it's a big question mark. I think in companies that are getting ahead of AI, I think we'll see dramatic growth and dramatic change. We're also going to see ethical issues. We're going to see a lot of security issues. So I think it remains to be seen.
Hey, Martha, we're Bloomberg. We follow the money. We got to talk money here. What's compensation looking like? VP level, executive level, C-level?
CTO,
Give us numbers here.
Sure. So I'm going to start with data scientists because that's the hottest new role going. A data scientist will cost about a base of $250,000. And then the variable comp on top of that, they could wind up being a $500,000 employee. But when you're seeing, you know, CTOs of these huge media companies, they could be in the $2 or $3 million range. These are the compensation for CTOs, CIOs, CISOs, Chief Innovation Officer, Chief Data Officers has gone up a lot. I don't think you can get a Chief AI Officer for under $1.5 million in a public company.
Interesting. And everybody's willing to spend because they need them.
They must have them. I believe, and I'll just say a little, I know we want to talk about the money. The biggest challenge to AI, the AI revolution for companies, is their inability, senior executives, to understand the impact that AI could have. So you hire a $2 million CTO, you spend the money, you know you think it's worthwhile, but you haven't changed your culture, you haven't changed your business model, you want to do what you've always done, except have an expensive CTI run AI. That's not enough of a change. So yes, there are many companies willing to invest, but investing in that person is not going to get you there. You need the technology, you need the culture, and you need the smarts about how AI is going to change what you do.
All right. Well, interesting perspective. Our whole control room is like, hey.
Hey, data, science? I know those two things.
Chapter 2, perhaps. Martha Heller, thank you so much. Founder and CEO of Heller Search, as we said earlier, an IT executive recruiting firm. They specialize in things like CIOs, CTOs, all those senior level talent dealing with technology.
Hey, speaking of the markets too, Carol, speaking of money, we're seeing some buy-in here on the S&P 500, up 1.3% right now. The NASDAQ composite up over 2% as we speak, while the Dow Jones Industrial Average higher by 1.2%.
Yeah, definitely off our worst levels, off our highs, but nonetheless, a very much more upbeat tone on the equity trade on this Friday. Take a look at the rate curve, and you've seen rates definitely back off some of the levels we saw earlier in the week. Speaking of stocks up, yields down, options insight, folks. That's coming up next. This is Bloomberg.
headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. We got Paramount Global shares falling 4.5% right now following a report in Variety that says there is an expectation among insiders at the company that the two deals it has been linked to will not ultimately proceed. Right now, we've got Paramount Global down by 4.9%. Apple shares higher after the company posted stronger than expected sales last quarter and predicted a return to growth in the current period, sparking optimism that a slowdown is easing. Apple, look at that, right now up by 7.2%. It's been more than 18 months since Apple last updated its iPad line, marking the longest gap in new models since Steve Jobs first unveiled the product in 2010. The drought will finally end on May 7th. That's the day that CEO Tim Cook is poised to introduce major upgrades to the iPad Pro and iPad Air, as well as new versions of the tablet's accessories. DraftKings has raised its annual target for sales and profit as the online betting giant sees continued growth in customers and betting revenue. Today, however, we've got shares of DraftKings. Right now, we've got DraftKings trading a little changed. Coinbase Global posting higher than forecast first quarter profit and revenue as a resurgence in cryptocurrency prices reawakens demand from individual investors. Coinbase down by 1.7%. And Amgen soaring after its CEO said he was very encouraged by early results from a study of the company's experimental obesity drug, Maritide. CEO Robert Bradway said, quote, "We recognize the significant increase in obesity." Amgen shares, they're higher now by 12.2%. Those are our top company stories at this hour. I'm Charlie Pellet, and this is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
All right, everybody, stocks rallying, yields backing off. It is time now for Options Insight. Bloomberg News Chief Markets Correspondent Abigail Doolittle with Carly Garner, founder of DeCarly Trading. Abigail, over to you.
Thanks so much, Carol and Carly. Great to have you with us. And, you know, we have the rally, not just on the day, but on the week. And we're actually looking at a second up week in a row. That, of course, follows 3 down weeks. And I can't help but thinking, even though the S&P 500 right now is only down 2.6% from its peak, basically in March, early April, it feels a little heavy. What do you think is next?
It does. I agree. On my chart, as long as the S&P stays below 5,200, the bears have a little bit of an edge. Now, if we start getting above 5,200, all bets are off. We probably go to 5,400 pretty easily. But I don't think that's going to be the case. Bear market, I think we're going into at least a big correction, maybe even a bear market. And if that's the case, bounces can be really, really big, and they can be deceptive, and they sucker in a lot of bulls, but they are generally short-lived. And I think that's what we're seeing.
And so, Carly, you have been into the last month or two, because when you joined us for Options Insight in the noon hour a couple of months ago, you were bearish at that time. It sounds like you're a little bit more bearish now, but into that, you were correctly bullish for a couple of years. Why have you turned? Why has the sentiment? What are you seeing that is causing you to be more bearish than you had been?
Well, I'm just saying that a lot of asset classes that are just insanely overheated. I might be old, maybe I'm just old, but these wild, very steeply sloped rallies don't feel right to me. It feels like what we're doing is pulling prosperity forward from the future, and then eventually we have to pay that back. We saw that in 2020, 2021, where we had those really big rallies, and then in 2023, early on, we gave a lot of it back, not most of it, but a lot of it. And then we've done the same thing from October lows through today. Basically, we've seen some really steep rallies, and it just feels like we're a little ahead of ourselves. The market needs to digest this. If you look at a long-term scope, the natural trading range on my chart, the S&P is between 3,900 and 4,900. So we're still trading above that. And I think the equilibrium price for fundamentals and charting slope is more like 4,500. So we're still really overpriced based on my models.
Yeah, based on my quick look at a few of the charts, I don't disagree with you. That seems like we could go down to at least 4,600 pretty quickly. You were just talking about some overheated markets. Cocoa had been one of them. Talk to us in about 30 seconds about some of the other ones, and what are you seeing options-wise?
Sure. So cocoa has been super dysfunctional. It's almost acting like GameStop did in 2021 before the financial markets corrected. And honestly, even though cocoa seems unrelated to stocks, I think it's actually telling us something. And as far as options go, I think now is the time to be proactive in hedging. Sell calls, buy puts. You can sell July S&P 500 calls in the 4,400 strike price, and then use the money to buy a 4,900 put. So you have free insurance. You're giving up gains above the short option or the short call strike price, but it should be enough to get you through the next couple of months while we see what happens.
Great perspective. Happy Friday to you. Have a wonderful weekend. Carly Garner of DeCarly Trading. Carol, back to you.
I always love it when you guys are talking levels. Gives me some points to kind of.
I thought you were going to say I love it when you're talking cocoa because, like,
who doesn't love talking cocoa? All right, everybody, getting ready to wrap up on this hour of Bloomberg Business Week, and yeah, we've got a rally underway. It was interesting what Abigail was talking about after 3 down weeks on the S&P 500 to see that we're on track for a second up week. So interesting.
All right, we'll keep following the markets for the next hour plus. For those of you watching on TV, up next is the close. For those staying with us, Bloomberg Business Week continues on radio, YouTube, and originals. Coming up over the next couple of hours, we got Berkshire Hathaway's annual meeting tomorrow. It's going to be its first without Charlie Munger. We're going to get a preview of what to expect and also a Bloomberg opinion piece about how crazy it would be if Warren Buffett bought Boeing.
Anything's possible. Also, preview of tonight's Bloomberg Wall Street Week with David Weston. How you can own a watch from legendary F1 champ Michael Schumacher, and Nate Checketts, co-founder and CEO of Roan, expanding the brand. It's all coming up on Bloomberg Business Week. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, everybody, a very good afternoon. Bloomberg Business Week continuing on radio, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals. We are 60 minutes away from that closing bell. Carol Masser along with Tim Stenevec, Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We are here. We are across our platforms. And, yeah, we're watching the markets, seeing how we end up this week.
Yeah, yields moving lower. We're seeing stocks moving higher. We just heard some great technicals from Abigail Doolittle talking about the rally that we've seen over the last couple of weeks. Seems to be getting a little more steam after what we heard from the Fed this week, Carol, and especially that weaker than expected jobs numbers.
It'll be interesting, too, to see what Warren Buffett says, maybe, perhaps. Tomorrow is the Berkshire Hathaway's annual meeting, a big gathering. It's its first annual meeting without Charlie Munger. So we're going to talk about kind of the environment, some of the topics that are going to be top of mind, see maybe what he has to say about the macro. And speaking of Berkshire Hathaway, great column on the Bloomberg about this possibility. I mean, how crazy would it be if Warren Buffett and Berkshire maybe bought Boeing?
Okay, before you say no, there are some reasons why it could work out. We'll talk about those in just a minute. Also, a preview of what's coming up tonight on Bloomberg Wall Street Week. David Weston is going to be stopping by a little bit later.
Maybe David's in the market for a watch. I mean, a timepiece. They're different. There's a distinction.
Timepieces. Please, Carol.
I know David likes cars, so maybe one from legendary F1 champ Michael Schumacher. We're going to talk about this. That's because Christie's is auctioning them off.
Also, Nate Checketts, the founder and CEO of the apparel company Roan, is going to be back with us, and he's got a big update. He'll share with us a little later this hour.
All right, let's get you going with just about 59 minutes to go until we wrap up the trading day and week. Let's head on over back to Charlie Pellet. You're okay?
Yeah, I'm 100%. Okay. Absolutely 100%. And don't eat nuts before you go on the air. That's all I'm saying there. We've got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all advancing right now. The big question, will we hold on to those gains through the closing bell? Got to keep it locked into Bloomberg Radio to find out for sure. So here's where we stand. S&P up 64, up 1.3%. 51.28 right now on the S&P. The Dow up 451, up 1.2%. We've got NASDAQ up 320, a gain there of 2%. 10-year, 4.50% with a 2-year, 4.80%. Spot gold down 0.3%, 22.98 the ounce. Crude oil down 1.1%, 78.06. And cannot ignore the move in Bitcoin right now, up 5%, 61,690 on Bitcoin. Wall Street took a slowdown in the jobs market as an indication that the Fed will be able to start cutting rates as early as September. Traders sending stocks up sharply sharply as bond yields fell. Apple shares higher after the company posted stronger than expected sales last quarter and predicted a return to growth in the current period, sparking optimism that a slowdown is easing. Right now, Apple shares, they're surging by 7%, certainly helping boost sentiment today. Again, recapping the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all higher. S&P up 65, up 1.3%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, thank you so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Well, when Berkshire Hathaway devotees gather in Omaha tomorrow for the annual meeting, there's going to be a noticeable void on stage. The meeting is Berkshire's first since Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's longtime business partner and right-hand man, died. That was back in November. And Carol, it was just shy of his 100th birthday.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, a long-time relationship, and you can tell, you know, obviously personal as well as obviously professional. Sally Bakewell is Bloomberg News America's finance team leader. She writes about how this year's meeting will be different. Sally joins us from New York. Sally, yeah, I think that first the image, right, of not having Charlie there with Warren up on stage is going to be very different.
Candy, you know, all the stuff that they always have on stage there as part of the annual meeting.
Yeah.
It's like the two of them are iconic, the same way that Berkshire's portfolio companies are iconic.
Exactly. So, like, how are you thinking about, you know, this meeting and how it will be without Charlie sitting next to Warren?
I think it can't be underestimated, you know, the level of admiration, affection, and esteem that Munger was held in, both by Buffett and by Berkshire shareholders and the attendees of this meeting. You know, Buffett called him the architect of Berkshire, really, you know, right back at the start of this whole thing, when Berkshire was, in essence, a collection of failing textile mills. It was Munger who said, you know, don't buy companies like this anymore. Add wonderful businesses purchased at fair prices and give up buying fair businesses at wonderful prices, you know, in his trademark kind of witty, quippy style. And they want, you know, to own either all or a portion of businesses that have good economics and that are fundamental and enduring, which, you know, raises the question about Boeing there. So I think, yeah, and it had success. It has a 20% compounded annual gain on Berkshire stock since Buffett took over. That compares with the 10% of the S&P. And so I think, you know, there will be a profound sort of absence there. And of course, we all know that Munger was deeply knowledgeable. He was witty. He was a kind of cutting reality check. And he's you know, come out with some pretty wonderful, quite scathing quips over his time. You know, one of the favorites is, he asked, what do you think a derivatives trading desk is? It's a casino in drag.
Also, let's not forget any comments about crypto or Bitcoin that have been fun, that were fun over the last few years. That said, Sally, he won't be alone. He'll have up there with him Greg Abel, who's 61. He runs all non-insurance operations, and Ajit Jain, who oversees Berkshire's insurance business. Two names that are very familiar to those who've been following Berkshire Hathaway, especially over the last few years, as succession questions have arisen. Talk to me about those two and what they'll be doing up there.
Yeah, we have been hearing a little more from each of them over the course of the last few years, or since 2021, when Buffett said, you know, it's going to be Abel who takes over when I retire or when he passes away, and he is 93. So I think, you know, we know that Abel is the person behind a lot of Berkshire Hathaway's previous acquisitions. You know, that's his role. He's been the guy to find deals, to execute deals. He's, you know, reputedly done some deals almost entirely on his own. So I think investors will be very eager to hear, and they might not get this information, by the way, but they will be eager to hear about, you know, where he is thinking Berkshire can start to, you know, allocate some of this $168 billion cash pile that it's got sort of sitting on the sidelines, waiting for deals to come along. And then with Ajit Jain, he, you know, we don't hear too much from him. He was a contender for the CEO prize, but I think they went to Abel because he's a slightly younger guy and was seen as someone who was more fitting for the Berkshire culture.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? And I do wonder, you know, how it all plays out tomorrow, because going back to Charlie, is there some kind of tribute that we are expecting?
I think there's usually a video, a kind of mini movie that takes place just before the shareholder meeting starts, and it starts at 9:15 Central Time. And I think, yes, that video, you can well imagine that being a significant tribute to Munger. Buffett, in his annual letter this year, he spent a lot of time paying tribute to Munger, again, as the kind of architect of Berkshire Hathaway.
I also do wonder, too, if Warren kind of just lets it sit with that idea of kind of no big changes, or will he use the moment to either, I don't know, announce some big deal, like you said, the cash position? Like, I'm just curious about the mechanics, because there's a lot going on at this meeting, and it's obviously going to be emotionally charged.
I mean, I think there are two big sort of questions about this meeting. One, I think maybe we can answer with some confidence. The question was whether he might seize this moment to retire. It's when he is before his devotees, his adoring fans. Is this the time? Munger passed away in November, that he might. Generally, the people that we've spoken to think that he won't do that. There's not been enough sort of walking up to it. People don't know enough about his investing deputies. They haven't heard enough from Abel in order for him to sort of make a sort of slightly shock announcement like that. But you can't rule it out. And in terms of deals, well, there just don't seem to have been anything that he could necessarily have bought. And, just in February, he was sort of lamenting and decrying the fact that they will not have a shot of sort of eye-popping results that they have had in the past, because they don't have these sort of big ticket deals that have really helped kind of burnish Buffett's reputation as a billionaire investor. So it's hard to see him announcing anything significant along those lines.
I just have I think a lot of people would argue they have a hard time seeing Warren Buffett retiring ever. I mean, this is a guy who who lives to do what he's been doing for the majority of his life. Very briefly, 30 seconds before we let you go. We like to look to Warren Buffett in the annual meeting of Berkshire Hathaway to get an idea of what's going on with the global economy. What are the signs you're looking for, whether it's within the insurance business or even just general commentary from Buffett and co. about what the economy looks like?
Right. Yeah, this is very important. Last year, he predicted.
What a time for her computer to freeze.
Wait. I think we have her back. Come on in.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
We lost you at very important.
Okay. Perfect continuity. Yeah, his predictions for the economy will be crucial. He said just this time last year that this incredible period for the US economy is drawing to an end, and he predicted lower earnings for all of his businesses. That actually didn't go on to happen. Rates are higher for longer, inflationary pressures remain. So we'll all be on the lookout for what he says. I mean, his businesses are so expansive. They reflect the US economy. They reflect US economic health. They take the sort of brunt of interest rate hikes and inflation because they're building companies, they're manufacturers, they're retail. So, he is Berkshire is the barometer for how the US economy is doing.
All right. Well, looking forward to what he has to say about the macro and also all of those questions that they take during this event. Sally, thank you so much. Sally Bakewell, she's America's finance team leader at Bloomberg News, joining us right here in New York City.
Well, speaking of Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway, here's a conversation starter ahead of the company's annual meeting. Warren Buffett should buy Boeing. That line, courtesy of Thomas Black, Bloomberg Opinion Manufacturing, Logistics, and Aerospace columnist, who argues in his most recent piece that Berkshire has the cash for a deal. Boeing needs great leadership, and airlines want planes. Thomas joins us from Dallas, and if you haven't yet read this story, which is among the most read on the Bloomberg terminal, check it out on OPIN Go, on the terminal, or at bloomberg.com/opinion. Thomas, as you write, there are lots of reasons that this is outlandish. Berkshire's conservative, Buffett doesn't do turnarounds, Berkshire tends to go after companies with strong leadership, and Boeing's leadership, I think it's fair to say, is in transition, one could argue. So what are the reasons that Buffett should do this?
There's a lot of opportunity there. Just look at the backlog of planes, just south of 6,000 planes, about 450 billion backlog. So that's the opportunity. They just have to Boeing has to get its house in order. Somebody has to come in and save Boeing. And I would say, aside from Larry Culp, right, he would be perfect. But if he weren't available, I would say Berkshire would be a great candidate to save this iconic manufacturer.
I think one other thing too that you do talk about is this idea of a moat, and Warren Buffett's always looking for businesses that have a moat, that competition really doesn't exist. I mean, and there's no better duopoly out there than Boeing and Airbus, because and a lot of companies can't really switch planes. Like Southwest, for example, isn't going to be ordering any Airbus planes in the near future. So I think that's also a big part of this too.
Yeah, it's a great market. And Boeing was a leader in this market. Airbus has taken it over, but this is why a strong leader needs to come in, take Boeing, create a clean sheet aircraft that can replace the 737 and regain its leadership. Somebody has to take this company and turn it around and take it to the next step. And that's part of it, is that it's got a great market. You do have, if Boeing does weaken and it really does become problematic, you have the Chinese building a single aisle passenger plane, the Comac 919, and all the Chinese airlines are buying it. But other countries could buy that if that plane turns out to be airworthy. So, and then you have Embraer. I don't know if you saw in the Wall Street Journal, they also are talking about maybe doing a single aisle. So there could be competition if Boeing continues to be weak.
It's interesting, though. You say, paying for Buffett around this purchase, and you talk about precision cast parts, which makes specialized components for aircraft. They bought it for $32 billion in 2016, ended up writing down $11 billion post-pandemic after we saw the commercial aviation industry just kind of upended. You talk about, back in 2020 of May, Berkshire and Buffett getting out of all of their holdings in the 4 largest U.S. airlines. So he's definitely backed away. So it's interesting. Like, I think about, Thomas, like the whiteboard, like we have to make a decision, pros, cons. So when you think about it with Warren Buffett and Berkshire, there are more pros and cons, and help us understand kind of the balance here that might make him either say yes more likely or no more likely.
Right. Well, there is a rebound in the aerospace industry, especially on the supplier side. So, Precision is doing better now. Their pre-tax earnings were up 30% last year from the year before. So there is a rebound there. Now, the airlines have not recovered fully if you look at their share prices before the pandemic. But the moats are small around the airlines, so it's highly competitive. So I think that business probably doesn't fit with Berkshire, whereas Precision cast parts, it could.
So do you think this is something that will seriously, not necessarily come up, but something that will seriously be entertained, given Berkshire Hathaway's history, given their other investments? I mean, is this something that you think people should really take seriously?
I don't think it's going to happen. I wrote this column because I thought, this is kind of a cool idea.
I love it.
Toy with, right? And I'm sure other people are thinking the same thing. So I figured I'd just throw it out there and let people toy around with it.
Well, I will tell you, I know I already said this, but people are toying around with it because it is among the most read on the Bloomberg terminal. So a lot of people are into it.
Well, basic math, you say, the cash pile that Buffett's got is what, $168 billion, market cap of $110 billion. He could write the check today and just be done with it.
Well, $110 billion. That's the size of Apple's share buyback that was announced yesterday, too. So.
That's right. They might have to pay a premium, but it's still, $150 billion would probably shareholders would be happy to turn the keys over to Warren Buffett on this thing.
Thomas, is it all about, though, he obviously looks for value. He looks for, he's got his little check boxes or things that he's got to check before he makes a purchase. Is it something, it's got to be about, really, though, you talk about returns, or we talked about with Sally Bakewell, the consistent returns that Berkshire has provided to investors long term. It's got to be, though, a company that's going to provide those returns, ultimately.
Yes, and I think you think about Boeing as where GE was when John Flannery was CEO. If you remember, he came in and the ship was, out of kilter, but he diagnosed the problems, right? He knew what the problem were. He had diagnosed those. Dave Calhoun has now done that, just like John Flannery has diagnosed the problems. They need somebody to come in who can execute and put together a plan and fix Boeing. So I think we're at that point where it could turn around and it could be a great investment.
I want to end with a couple things that you mentioned just a couple minutes ago. One is Embraer potentially getting into a single aisle plane, that story in the Wall Street Journal yesterday. And then the Comac, the China story as well, working on their own version of a 737-like plane. What are how worried do Boeing and Airbus have to be about these two developments?
If I don't think that much, especially Airbus, right? It's got a nice setup. It just needs its supply chain to feed it more supplies so it can make more planes. Yeah. If Boeing got its house in order, I don't think they would have to worry about that. But again, if Boeing doesn't, those are the ones that could see some opportunity out of this. So I think it's imperative that Boeing do well, not only just for the shareholders and so forth, but for the country. We need a leading aerospace company. It's not only just commercial aircraft, it's space as well too.
Yeah.
A very important player there in defense, of course.
All right, Thomas Black, thank you so much. Bloomberg Opinion, manufacturing, logistics, and aerospace columnist. Coming up, if you're in the market for a timepiece, stay here.